The most powerful man in the city couldn't save the one person who mattered. The people he'd spent his life ignoring could. If you've ever watched someone lose everything in a single moment, not slowly, not gradually, but all at once, like a floor giving out beneath your feet, then you already know how this story starts. Victor Marcelli controlled half this city. He had judges, senators, police captains eating from his hand. He had more money than 3 generations could spend. And in one night, on a mountain he'd never thought about, it meant absolutely nothing. Stay with this story until the end. If it reaches you, if it makes you feel something, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The call came at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and Victor Marcelli was in the middle of making a man apologize. Not apologize in the way ordinary people apologize, with words and eye contact and maybe a handshake. The man across the table from him, a mid-level port official named Dennis Crane, was apologizing with his hands pressed flat against the mahogany, his palms sweating through the expensive wood finish, his voice doing that particular thing voices do when the body understands it is in genuine danger and the brain hasn't caught up yet. He was talking too fast, explaining a discrepancy in the shipping manifest that had cost Victor's operation $400,000 in seized product and 2 men arrested at the port gate. Victor wasn't listening anymore. He was watching the way Dennis's left thumb kept pressing into the table's surface, a rhythmic, involuntary motion, like the man's body was trying to crawl away without him. Victor had seen that before. He'd seen it enough times that it no longer told him anything interesting about the person doing it, only confirmed what he already knew. That every man, given enough pressure, reduced to the same animal, the same sweat, the same trembling, the same eyes that couldn't hold still. He was 43 years old and he was tired of it. His phone buzzed against the inside of his jacket and he ignored it. His phone buzzed again. Across the room, near the door, his head of security, a heavy-set man named Roland Greer, who'd worked for the family for 11 years, shifted his weight and glanced at the screen of his own device. Victor caught that glance. Roland didn't look up from the phone right away, which was unusual. Roland always looked up. "Give us a minute," Victor said. Dennis Crane stopped talking, mid-sentence, so fast it was almost comical. "Not you," Victor said. "Stay where you are." His 3 other men filtered out. Roland was the last to move, and when he reached the door, he turned and looked at Victor with an expression that Victor had seen on the man's face exactly twice in 11 years. Once when Victor's father died. Once when they lost 2 men in a warehouse fire that should never have happened. "It's about your mother," Roland said. "There's been an accident." The room didn't change. The chandelier above the table kept throwing the same amber light across the mahogany. Dennis Crane's palms were still sweating. The city outside the window was still doing what cities do at midnight, breathing its own particular combination of exhaust and money and other people's misery. None of it changed. Victor's chest did something it hadn't done in a long time. It tightened. Not with anger, which he knew well, but with something older and less manageable, something that lived below the level of choice. "What kind of accident?" he said, and his voice came out flat and precise, because that was the only voice he had access to right now. Roland told him. A luxury passenger train, the Ardmore Continental, one of those private rail services that wealthy people used when they wanted the romance of train travel without the inconvenience of sharing space with the public. His mother had boarded it 2 days ago in the city, headed northeast toward the Kelso Mountain region where the Marcelli family maintained a private estate. A gathering, she'd told him, old friends, some of the extended family, a long weekend away from the city noise that she'd been wanting for months. Victor had arranged her ticket himself. He'd had 2 of his men ride the train as private security, positioned in the adjacent car. He'd called her that morning when she boarded and listened to her complain, warmly and without real complaint, about the size of her sleeping compartment and the fact that the dining car didn't have the particular kind of sparkling water she preferred. He'd told her to order something else. She'd laughed. "The line went down about 6 hours ago," Roland said. "The train entered the Kelso Pass and they're saying some kind of landslide event. Storm came through the mountains fast. The track gave out on a curve above the Arden Creek Gorge. Victor stood up from the table. He didn't tell Dennis Crane anything. He walked past Roland and into the hallway and pulled out his own phone and looked at the screen. 4 missed calls from a number he didn't recognize. One from his attorney, one from a man named Sal Ferretti, who ran his northeastern operations and who knew better than to call Victor's personal line unless something was burning down. He called Sal. "Tell me," he said when the line connected. "Victor?" Sal's voice had that same quality Roland's face had, carefully constructed around something bad. "We're getting fragmentary information. The pass is remote. Emergency services got the call, but the roads up there are... Look, the storm's still active in the upper elevations. They're saying response time to the site could be 4 hours minimum, maybe more. My men on the train. No contact, both phones going straight to voicemail. My mother." Silence. Not a long silence. 2 seconds, maybe 3. But Sal Ferretti did not hesitate on phone calls. In 12 years working for the Marcelli family, the man had never once needed 3 seconds to formulate a sentence. "No contact," Sal said. "Victor, the reports are... It's early. There's a lot of noise in the information, but some of what's coming through from locals near the pass is not good. There are people saying the front cars went into the gorge." Victor was already moving. Down the hallway, past the paintings his father had chosen and he'd never bothered to replace, past the kitchen where someone had left a light on, down the rear stairwell to the private garage beneath the building. His hand was on the door to the garage when he realized Roland was right behind him and had been the whole time, not saying anything, just there, the way a good soldier is always just there. "Get me a vehicle," Victor said. "Get me 4 men. Get me whatever equipment we have for mountain terrain and get it in the back of something that can handle elevation in a storm. Make the calls to emergency services and tell them who I am and find out what they actually know versus what they're saying to the public. Get Sal moving northeast with our Kelso contacts and get me a helicopter. I don't care what it costs. I don't care who you have to wake up." "Helicopter won't fly in this weather," Roland said. "Not in the mountains tonight." "Then find me one that will." He got into the passenger seat of the first vehicle Roland produced, a black SUV with enough horsepower to push through almost anything, and sat with his phone in both hands and looked at the last text message his mother had sent him. It was from yesterday afternoon, sent while the train was still moving through the flat lowlands, hours before it reached the mountains. "The scenery is beautiful, Victor. You should see it. You work too much." He'd read it while sitting across a table from 2 men whose names he couldn't remember now, discussing a real estate acquisition that seemed, at this moment, to be located on another planet. He hadn't responded. The SUV pulled out of the garage into the wet city street, and Victor put his phone face down on his knee and looked straight through the windshield and didn't think about the text message. Thinking about it wasn't useful. Feeling things about it wasn't useful. What was useful was speed, information, resources, and the application of concentrated force toward a specific problem. He had been doing that since he was 22 years old. He was good at it. He told himself it would be enough. The drive northeast through the city took 40 minutes at this hour, moving fast through empty commercial corridors and past the industrial waterfront and out through the eastern suburbs, where the streets widened and the buildings got lower, and eventually the light pollution started thinning and the highway opened up ahead of them into darkness. Victor made 7 calls in those 40 minutes. He reached 3 people who had real information and 4 people who had theories dressed up as information, and he learned to tell the difference fast. What he learned was this. The Ardmore Continental had been carrying 31 passengers and 12 crew members. It had entered the Kelso Pass at approximately 9:15 in the evening, running behind schedule due to weather delays in the lowland sections. The pass curved sharply at the 4,200-foot elevation marker, following a century-old rail line that hugged the eastern face of the mountain above the Arden Creek Gorge. The storm, which had been rated moderate when the train entered the mountains, had intensified rapidly in the upper elevations, a phenomenon the mountain weather systems in this region were apparently known for, though no one had apparently known this well enough to halt the train. The landslide had taken out approximately 60 feet of track. The locomotive and the first 2 passenger cars had gone off the line. The remaining 3 passenger cars and the rear service car had derailed but remained to varying degrees on or near the original track bed, slammed against the mountain face and each other, compromised in ways that emergency responders couldn't yet fully assess because emergency responders had not yet reached the site. 4 hours. Minimum. Victor understood for the first time since Roland had come to the door the specific texture of what he was facing. Not just an accident, not just a logistics problem to be solved with money and men and influence. He was facing geography. He was facing weather. He was facing time. Not the kind of time you could buy or bend or move to a different meeting, but the kind that moved at its own speed regardless of who you were and what you owned. He was facing something he couldn't make apologize. The highway began climbing somewhere around the 3rd hour. The gradient increasing and the road narrowing from 4 lanes to 2, and then to a broken 2-lane blacktop that Roland navigated with the SUV's high beams cutting through rain that had shifted from drizzle to something more committed. Victor had stopped making calls. There was nothing new to learn by phone. Everything useful now was going to come from being at the site. And they were not at the site. In the silence of the vehicle, with the rain on the roof and Roland focused on the road, Victor's mind did what minds do when there's nothing to act on and nothing to plan. It went backward. He was 9 years old and his mother was ironing in the kitchen of the apartment on Della Street, the one with the warped floorboards and the radiator that clanged all night in winter. She was ironing his father's shirts and listening to something on the radio, and she was humming along without realizing she was humming, the way people do when they're genuinely, quietly content with the exact moment they're in. Victor had stood in the doorway for a long time without saying anything, not wanting to interrupt it. He didn't know, at 9, what his father's business actually was. He knew there was money sometimes and no money other times. He knew men came to the apartment late and left again without speaking to him. He knew his mother smiled at him differently than she smiled at anyone else. Not wider, exactly, but more carefully. Like the smile was something she was choosing with full knowledge of what she was choosing. He'd thought about that smile a lot over the years. As he got older and learned what his family was and eventually became part of it, and then the top of it, he'd thought about whether she knew what she was building when she raised him. Whether the same hands that ironed shirts and made the particular soup he still associated with being cared for had also, through some alchemy of love and survival and stubborn determination, shaped the man who now moved through the world the way Victor Marcelli moved through it. He'd never asked her. There were things you didn't ask your mother. "Road's closing," Roland said. Victor came back to the present. Through the windshield he could see brake lights, their own people in the second vehicle behind them, and ahead, a cluster of emergency vehicles blocking the road where the blacktop made a sharp turn into the trees. A state trooper in a rain jacket was waving them down, one hand raised, flashlight cutting through the weather. Roland lowered the window. "Road's closed," the trooper said. He was young, mid-20s, rain on his face, the particular expression of someone who'd been standing in bad weather for hours and had fully accepted that this was his night. Landslide activity, and the pass road itself has compromised sections above 3,800 feet. Nobody goes up. "I have people on that train," Victor said from the passenger seat. The trooper looked across at him. Something in the way Victor said it, the flatness, the weight, made the young man pause. "Sir, I understand. There are a lot of families with people on that train. The road is closed." "What's the current status of the rescue operation?" "I can't share operational details with—" "What's the current status?" The trooper's flashlight moved slightly, an involuntary response. "Ground teams are trying to reach the site by foot through the access trail on the north face. There's a fire department technical rescue unit out of Millhaven that got a call 3 hours ago and is en route. Estimated time to the site is still 4 hours," Victor said. The trooper didn't answer, which was its own answer. Victor looked at the road above the checkpoint. The trees closed over it 50 yards up. The darkness beyond was complete. "Roland," he said. "Yeah. Get me someone who knows this mountain." It took 40 minutes to find Dex Hartwell, and Victor would later understand that those 40 minutes were among the most important of his life, though not for any reason he expected. Dex Hartwell was 61 years old, a retired forestry surveyor who lived in a converted barn 12 miles from the Kelso Pass checkpoint. He answered the door in wool socks and a flannel shirt and looked at the 4 men standing outside with an expression that was not surprised, Exactly, but was whatever is one step past unsurprised. The face of someone who has already processed the fact that tonight was going to be unusual and has made his peace with it. I know who you are, Dex said to Victor before Victor could speak. Your family's got the estate up on the Ardmore side. I've done survey work up there. The Ardmore train. I heard. Dex looked at the rain, then back at Victor. Your people on it? My mother. Dex was quiet for a moment, not the tactical quiet of someone deciding what they can extract from the situation, but the actual quiet of a man absorbing information that has weight. Come in, he said. Inside, over a kitchen table with a topographic map of the Kelso region spread across it, Dex walked Victor through the mountain's anatomy. The pass road, closed by the slide. The fire department access trail, navigable on foot but 4 hours minimum, more in this weather. A network of old logging roads on the western face, mostly unmaintained, that Dex had cataloged years ago for the Forestry Service. There's a third option, Dex said, and put his finger on a section of the map where the topographic lines bunched together. The Arden Creek villages. Here. And here. Victor looked at the map. 2 small settlements, marked in the light print, reserved for places too small to matter much. Hallow Ford and Greer's Hollow. No roads connecting them to the pass road. The only approach to the crash site that didn't require going through the blocked pass road or the 4-hour rescue trail apparently ran directly through these communities. Villages, Victor said. Communities. Small ones. Been there for 3-4 generations. Mostly people the county stopped paying attention to decades ago. Dex's voice was matter of fact, not accusatory, just reporting the geography. They're poor, they're isolated, and they're about 1.5 miles from where that train came down. There's a path they use that connects Hallow Ford directly to the gorge overlook. If anyone's already at that crash site, it's them. Victor looked at the map. Then he looked at Roland. Get the vehicles turned around, he said. We're going the other way. The road to Hallow Ford was not a road in any sense that Victor's vehicles were designed for. It was a fire track, gravel over clay, and the rain had been working on it for hours with the particular dedication rain has when it finds soil it can move. The first vehicle, the lead SUV, dropped its front left tire into a rut that swallowed it to the axle 40 minutes in, and it took 20 minutes and the combined effort of all 4 of Victor's men to get it back on passable ground. Victor stood in the rain while they worked and looked up the track into the darkness above, and felt the mountains in a way he was not accustomed to feeling things, which is to say physically, with his whole body, as information about his own smallness that couldn't be argued with or negotiated around. He was not a small man in any room he'd ever been in. He had made himself specifically into someone for whom smallness was not possible, not a mode of existing he'd allowed himself since he was a boy, watching his father be small in the ways that cost a man everything. The mountain didn't care. They reached Hallow Ford at 2:40 in the morning. It was barely a community in the physical sense, a cluster of wood frame houses and a corrugated metal building that might have been a workshop gathered around a break in the trees where a creek crossed the track. Every light in every house was on. They were not the only vehicles here. There were trucks, old ones, working trucks with dented beds and rust in the wheel wells, the kind that get used rather than maintained. There were people moving between them with flashlights and hand tools and what looked, in the rain and the dark, like climbing rope coiled over people's shoulders. Men and women both in the mix, working with the particular efficiency of people who know what they're doing and don't need to be directed. Victor got out of the SUV and stood in the rain and watched. A woman in her 50s, heavy-set, wearing a canvas jacket that had been waterproofed by use rather than design, was directing the loading of a flatbed truck with wooden boards and what looked like hand jacks. She had a flashlight clamped between her jaw and her shoulder, both hands occupied, and she was talking to a teenage boy who was listening with the absolute focus of someone for whom this is not a drill. Victor approached her. "Who's in charge here?" The woman turned her head, which required repositioning the flashlight with her shoulder. She looked at him, his clothes, his men behind him, the 2 SUVs with their city plates, with an assessment that was brief and thorough and not particularly impressed. "Caleb Ward," she said. He went up the path 20 minutes ago with the first group. What path? The gorge path, creek path, goes up through the hollow to the overlook, then down into the site. She went back to what she was doing. Your people on the train? My mother. She paused very briefly, and something moved through her expression. Not pity. Victor would have hated pity. Something more like recognition. My sister-in-law's on it, she said. Caleb's got 2 cousins. She handed the teenage boy a rope end. Don't let it knot. Keep it moving. She looked at Victor again. You want to stand here or you want to come? He came. The path through the hollow was 60 inches wide at its most generous, carved by decades of foot traffic and seasonal flooding into the mountainside above the creek. Victor's Italian dress shoes were destroyed inside the first 100 yards. He didn't notice. His 4 men were behind him, and they were struggling more than he was because they were carrying equipment that the path hadn't been built for, and because they were fit in the specific way of men who train in gyms, rather than the specific way of people who have been climbing this mountain their entire lives. The woman's name was June Hartley, and she navigated the path in the dark with a flashlight she rarely needed to use. She knew where the path narrowed, where the exposed root system created a natural step, where the water runoff crossed the trail and had to be jumped. She knew all of this the way Victor knew which table in a restaurant to take and which exit from a building to use, as accumulated knowledge so embedded it was no longer knowledge, but just the shape of the world. How far? Victor said. 25 minutes this pace. The crash. We heard it, June said. She said it flat, not performing the statement. 6-7 hours ago. We heard it before we saw the smoke from the signal fire someone in the wreck set. She stepped over something without breaking stride. Caleb had people moving inside 40 minutes. Victor processed this. His men, 2 trained security professionals with mountain gear, had been on the road for hours and hadn't reached the site. The people from this hollow had been at it for 6 and had been moving toward the problem within 40 minutes of knowing it existed. He didn't call emergency services, Victor said. It came out slightly wrong, too close to an accusation. June glanced back at him. We did. Sat on hold for 30 minutes with the county dispatch who told us they were aware and sending resources. Resources. She turned back to the path. We called twice more. At that point, Caleb figured we'd let the resources catch up when they could. The path climbed steeply in its final section, switchbacking up a rocky face where handholds were necessary, where Victor's men behind him were audibly working against the grade and the wet rock. Victor climbed without using his hands if he could manage it and use them when he couldn't and didn't think about what his jacket looked like. They heard the sight before they saw it. Not screaming, something more controlled than that. Voices multiple, with the cadence of coordinated work, the sound of metal moving against metal, a deep grinding that suggested things being shifted that were very heavy. Light, not the cold blue of emergency equipment, but warmer, more varied. Lanterns, headlamps, truck lights from somewhere below. The path crested and Victor stopped. The gorge opened below him, not vertically, but at a steep angle, the creek visible as a pale thread 200 feet down. The train was, what was left of the train was on the slope above the creek, and calling it a train now required some commitment to the original concept. The first 2 cars were gone, down into the gorge, not visible. The remaining 4 cars were piled against the mountain face at angles that suggested enormous, sudden force. One car rotated nearly 40 degrees off its axis, another with its rear section still attached to the track bed and its front half hanging over space, connected to the rest by metal that was doing work it was not designed to do. Around and through this, in the dark and the rain, people were moving. Victor counted quickly. 15, maybe 18 people. Not professionals in safety gear, people in work clothes with tools that looked improvised or repurposed. He could see that a section of the wreckage had been partially cleared. Debris moved, a passage created between 2 of the cars. He could see 2 people emerging from inside the rearmost car, with a 3rd person between them, moving slowly, and other hands reaching to help. He could see at the center of it a man about his own age but built differently, lean and angular, with the economy of movement of someone who never moved without purpose. coordinating two separate operations simultaneously, talking to a group near the hanging car while pointing toward the passage that had been cleared. "That's Caleb," June said beside him. Victor watched Caleb Ward work for approximately 30 seconds, which was long enough to understand several things. First, that the man knew what he was doing, not in a trained technical sense, but in the more fundamental sense of someone who could read a complex, dangerous situation and prioritize within it in real time. Second, that the people around him trusted that capacity, not because they'd been told to, but because they'd watched it earn trust. Third, that the operation below him was not frantic. It was not panicked. It was not the chaos of untrained civilians stumbling at a disaster site. It was careful. It was methodical. It was, in the specific word that came to Victor's mind and surprised him with its arrival, dignified. He went down. The approach to the site from the overlook path was another 10 minutes, descending through loose rock and scrub vegetation with a rope line that someone had strung through the worst section. A rope that Victor recognized from the coil he'd seen loaded onto the flatbed truck back in the hollow as something these people had brought with them. Caleb Ward noticed him when he was still 20 feet away. The man had the peripheral awareness of someone who operates in dangerous environments, who has trained themselves to track the edges of their visual field. His eyes registered Victor, registered the men behind him, registered the expensive ruined clothes, and the expensive operational gear that Victor's men were still trying to organize into usefulness, and then went back to what he'd been doing. He didn't stop what he'd been doing. Victor reached him. "You're Caleb Ward." "I am." Caleb was holding a length of steel cable, feeding it through a manual pulley system that had been rigged to a boulder. "You're Marcelli." The name recognition stopped Victor for a half second. "You know who I am." "Everybody knows who you are." Caleb pulled the cable through, tested the tension, looked up at the angle of the line. "Your mother's in the second car, rear section, the part that's still on the grade. She's alive. She's got a broken wrist, maybe a broken rib, we're not certain. She was mobile when we got to her, but we've got her stationary now because the car is not stable and we need to shore up the floor section before we can safely move her." The information hit Victor somewhere behind his sternum, a complex impact that was simultaneously relief and shame and something he couldn't name. His mother was alive. She was 68 years old with a broken wrist and a possibly broken rib, and she was in a train car on a mountain in the dark, and strangers were keeping her alive. "I need to see her," he said. "Not yet." Caleb said it without looking at him, watching the cable. Victor was not accustomed to the word "not yet" used in that register. Not as a request, not as a negotiation opener, just as a plain fact about the situation. The last person who'd spoken to him that way without either flinching or escalating immediately afterward had been his mother. He felt something shift in his chest. Anger was the word for what should have been there, given who he was and how he moved through the world. Anger wasn't what arrived. "What do you need?" Victor said. Now Caleb looked at him. The look was brief and thorough, much like June's had been, and carried the same quality of assessment that wasn't interested in status. "4 more bodies for the lifting team on the far side of car 3. Your men look like they can handle load-bearing work." "They can." "Then send them over there. Talk to the woman in the red hat. She'll tell them what to do." He looked back at the cable. "You, stay here." "Why?" "Because," Caleb said, and there was nothing in his voice except the information. "The car your mother is in is going to need a decision made about it in the next hour. The floor section is compromised, and the second storm band is coming through in," he checked his watch, "about 90 minutes, maybe less. When that hits, this whole site changes. I need someone here who can make a call quickly when I tell them to. Your men will do what their boss tells them. That means I need the boss in reach." He pulled the cable again. The boulder held. "Can you do that?" Caleb said. Victor Marcelli had been asked that question, or versions of it, hundreds of times in his life. He had always answered yes without consideration, because the answer had always been yes, because he was the one who made calls, and the idea that he might not be able to make one had not been a category of reality he needed to consider. He said yes, and then, because something in the situation demanded it, he said something he hadn't said in a long time. "Tell me what I need to know." For the next 40 minutes, Victor worked. Not the work he knew, not the work of pressure and strategy and moving resources from a position of control. He worked with his hands, beside people he didn't know, in the dark and the rain, doing what he was told by a man who gave instructions the way good mechanics give them. Simply, specifically, with the assumption that the person listening is capable. He held the end of a rope when he was told to hold it, and kept it taut when he was told to keep it taut, and let it out slowly when he was told to let it out slowly. He put his shoulder against a section of frame when he was told to, and held it until his shoulder screamed and kept holding it. He was next to a woman in her 30s who had a deep cut on her forearm she was ignoring, and a boy, couldn't have been more than 17, who was working with a focus and steadiness that Victor had seen in experienced professionals twice the boy's age and seen rarely even there. The boy's name was Marcus. He was Caleb's nephew. He'd been on the mountain since 9 o'clock that evening, nearly 6 hours, and he had not once in the time Victor was near him complained or hesitated or looked at the hanging section of Car 3 with anything other than the level assessment of someone taking stock. "How many people still in the cars?" Victor said to him, during a brief interval where their particular section of work had paused. "7 that we know of. 3 we've gotten out. 1 we're worried about. Front of Car 2, hard to reach." Marcus looked at the car in question without drama. 2 others are walking wounded. They're moving. The other 3... He paused, reorganizing. "Your mother. An older man. Maybe 70. He's got a leg injury. We can't tell how bad. And a woman, middle-aged, unconscious when we found her, responsive now. 7 total passengers in this section. That we know of. We're not sure of Car 4. That's the one half off the line. We got 1 person out of there, but the structure is unstable. Caleb's been working the assessment on that one." Victor looked at Car 4, the one tilted out over the gorge, connected to the track bed by what looked from here like determination and metal fatigue. "How is that still up?" "Frame caught on the rock ledge," Marcus said. 6-8 inches of ledge. That's what's holding it. 6 to 8 inches. Victor looked at the car, at the darkness of the gorge below it, at the rain still falling. "How many inside?" "We think 2. We've had voice contact. Caleb did the initial reach through the side window, the doors buckled, and we got 1 person partway out before the car shifted and we had to stop." "Stop and do what?" "Reassess," Marcus said. That's what he always says. Stop and reassess. Victor wanted to ask who trained this kid, who gave him this particular steadiness. He didn't ask because he could see the answer was standing 20 feet away in the rain managing a pulley system, and because the question felt too much like a luxury. He went back to work. It was at 3:47 in the morning, during a brief lull between operations, that Victor first heard his mother's voice. It came from inside the second car, from the rear section that was more or less stable, and it was not a sound of distress. It was clear and controlled, which was entirely consistent with the woman he knew. But there was something in the particular register of it, a quality he hadn't heard before, something rawer than what she usually allowed herself, that told him she was afraid in a way she was managing rather than not feeling. She was talking to someone near her. He could hear the other voice responding. A woman from the village, he thought, young from the sound, sitting with the passengers they hadn't moved yet. He went to the opening in the car's side, where the window had been removed, and put his head through. The interior of the car was lit by 2 lanterns hung from the overhead rack, one of which was running low. The floor was tilted about 15 degrees, not enough to make standing impossible, but enough to make everything require constant physical adjustment. There were 3 people inside the habitable section: the older man with the leg injury propped against the far wall, the woman who'd been unconscious now sitting up with her back against a seat, and his mother. Evelyn Marcelli was sitting on the floor of a wrecked train car in the Kelso Mountains, her right wrist wrapped in cloth torn from something, her gray hair loose from what had been an elegant arrangement earlier in the evening, and she was holding the hand of the woman next to her and talking to her in the steady, matter-of-fact tone she had used when Victor was a child, and something was frightening him that she'd decided he was capable of not being frightened by. She saw him. The expression on her face did something he'd spent 40 years watching her face do. It moved through whatever it was feeling and arrived at something presented outward, composed, chosen. But this time, the underneath showed for a second, and what was underneath was not calm. "Victor," she said. "Mom, you look terrible," she said. His jacket was ruined, his shoes were ruined. He had blood on his hands from a cut he hadn't noticed sustaining, and mud on his face, and his hair was flat from the rain. He was, objectively, not the person who had been sitting across a mahogany table from Dennis Crane some hours ago. "I know," he said. "Are you here with people? Your people?" "Yes, and the people from the village, the people from Hallow Ford." He looked at the woman his mother was holding the hand of. "Are you all right?" "She's been better," his mother said before the woman could answer. "We all have. Victor, the man over there, the leg injury, I know. We're working on getting him out as soon as the support structure is assessed. 15 minutes, maybe." His mother looked at him. She looked at him the way she had always looked at him, not as the man other people saw, not as the name that made rooms rearrange themselves, but as whoever he actually was, which she appeared to have the clearest vision of anyone he'd ever met. "The young man," she said, "who came to us first." "Caleb." "Yes." "He came through the window," she said. 3 hours ago, in the dark. He came through the window and he checked all 4 of us and he said, very specifically, 'We've got you,' not 'I've got you,' 'we've got you,' like there were more of them coming." She paused. "There were more of them coming." Victor held the edge of the window frame. The metal was cold and had a ragged edge that was going to cut him if he wasn't careful, and he was past caring about that. 3 hours ago," he said. "This is 6 hours into it." "I know." His mother's voice was steady. "Victor, he brought them out of their homes in the middle of the night in a storm. The woman who's been sitting with us, her name is Clara, she's from the Hollow. She walked up here in the dark with a first aid kit and 2 blankets." Evelyn looked at him with the expression he'd seen on her face exactly once before, at his father's funeral, when she'd understood something fully for the first time, and the understanding had cost her. "They didn't have to come." "Mom, nobody told them to come. Nobody was going to pay them. The county has been ignoring this community for 30 years, Victor. I know because I did some reading about the region because I was curious. I wanted to know the country I was passing through." She stopped. "They came anyway." Victor held the window frame. Outside, he could hear Caleb directing the lifting team, could hear the cable running through the pulley, could hear the creek below them in the gorge. "I'm going to get you out," he said. "I know you are," his mother said. "I never doubted it." She looked at him with something that was not exactly what she looked like when she was proud of him, but was related to it. A variation of that expression deployed for different circumstances. "But he got here first." Victor pulled his head out of the window and straightened and stood in the rain and looked across the site to where Caleb Ward was moving, steady and purposeful, in the way of someone for whom purpose was just the operating mode, rather than something he'd decided to demonstrate. He was 43 years old. He had been the kind of man who made other men afraid for 21 years. He had resources that this mountain community would not see in a generation combined. He had power that didn't reach this place, didn't mean anything up here, didn't have any purchase on the rain or the metal or the physics of a car balanced on 8 inches of ledge above a gorge. He had arrived here, to the mountain where his mother was, 4 hours after the people who lived on it. He was still processing what that meant when Caleb appeared at his shoulder. "Second storm ban," Caleb said. "It's moving faster than the read I got. 40 minutes, not 90. Victor came back to the operational reality immediately. "What changes?" "Everything in the open gets harder. Car 4 becomes extremely high risk. We need to decide right now whether we make a push for the 2 people inside or we pull back and secure the people we've already got access to and wait for the storm to pass." "How long would that wait be?" 4 or 5 hours minimum, maybe more." "The people inside car 4. "They're ambulatory, frightened. One of them has been communicating with us through the window. She sounded okay 20 minutes ago. But in 4 to 5 hours, in a compromised car structure, with another storm ban, the cold—" Caleb didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "What's your call?" Victor said. Caleb looked at him directly, and for the first time in their interaction, there was something in the look that was not pure operational assessment, something that was deciding something about Victor as a person rather than as a resource. "My call is we go for them now," Caleb said. "But I need your buy-in because I need your men on the anchor line and I need to know they'll hold when I tell them to hold, regardless of what the car does." "They'll hold." "If the car shifts, they'll hold," Victor said. "I'll be on the line with them." Caleb nodded. "Just once." "All right." He turned toward the site. "Then we move." What happened in the next 35 minutes was the most frightening thing Victor Marcelli had ever witnessed, and he had witnessed things that should have permanently claimed that title. Car 4 moved 3 times. Not catastrophically, but enough. 3 distinct shifts, the kind that translated through the anchor line into his hands as pure information about how little margin there was between the current situation and an entirely different situation. Each time, Caleb called to hold, and they held, and the car settled, and Caleb went back in through the side window of the tilted car where the angle made normal entry impossible, moving his body into a space that was either going to give him 2 survivors or was going to drop into the gorge with him inside it. He came back out the second time with the first of them, a woman in her 40s, a corporate attorney from the city who had been sitting in a tilted train car in the dark for 6 hours, and who emerged from the window with Caleb's hand at her back, and then stood on the rain-wet slope and looked around at the village people and the equipment and the whole improvised architecture of the rescue operation, and didn't speak, just breathed. He went back for the second. The car shifted again while he was inside. A long shift, this one, longer than the 3 before. The anchor line went taut with a force that drove the 3 men holding it, Victor's man on the left, Victor on the right, and Marcus in the center, back a full step, 2 steps, fighting for footing on wet rock. Victor heard metal from somewhere below the car, a deep tearing sound that was either something shearing or something catching. It caught. Caleb came out of the window with the second survivor, an older man, 60-something, who was shaking badly and whose face was the color of the rain. They came out together, and Marcus moved to take the man's weight, and the corporate attorney, who had been standing 20 feet away for the past 12 minutes, stepped forward without being asked and put her arm under the older man's other side and took some of the load. Victor looked at his hands on the anchor line. His hands were shaking, which was information he filed and would return to later. Caleb was breathing harder than he'd been breathing all night. The first acknowledgement in any of his physiology that what he'd just done was in any way outside the range of ordinary activity. "Car 4's gone," he said. He said it to no one in particular. "Don't go near it, not until daylight and not until structural assessment." He looked around the site. Did the count, rapidly. "Okay," he said. He said it with a particular finality, the word that means not okay. That means we are past the worst of it. That means we can breathe now. Though what follows is still going to be hard. "Let's get your mother out, Marcelli, before the rain comes back." They got her out 16 minutes later, through a combination of the pulley system and the manual lifting and the simple labor of 10 people working carefully in a space that didn't want to cooperate. She came through the side opening of the second car on a makeshift litter that the village people had constructed from materials Victor couldn't have identified. And when she was out and on the slope and Victor was crouching next to her in the rain, she looked at him. She looked at him for a long moment. "Your hands are bleeding," she said. "It's fine." "Victor." "Mom." "It's fine." She looked past him, then at Caleb Ward standing 10 feet away directing the extraction of the man with the leg injury. She looked at the village people working in the dark and the rain. She looked at Marcus, 17 years old, holding the anchor line with the same steadiness he'd had for hours. She looked back at her son. "Do you see them?" she said. And the way she said it, not as a question about his eyesight, but as something far older and more specific, as the question she'd been asking him in different forms for 20 years, and had never, until this moment, had the exact right illustration to attach it to. That stopped him cold. The rain started again. Not the drizzle they'd been working in for hours. The second storm band, arriving early, driving sideways across the gorge with a force that drove everyone toward whatever shelter the mountain offered. Caleb appeared next to him. "We need to move. The path back to the hollow is manageable if we go now. In 20 minutes it won't be." He looked at the litter. "She can be moved?" "Yes. Evelyn said, before Victor could. Caleb almost smiled. It wasn't a smile exactly. It was the tightening of something at the corner of his mouth, a brief involuntary acknowledgement of a particular quality he recognized. Then, let's move, he said. And Victor Marcelli, the man who made other men afraid, picked up one end of his mother's litter, and a village woman named June Hartley picked up the other, and they went up the path through the dark and the rain toward Hallow Ford, with Caleb Ward leading the way. He didn't know yet what was coming. He didn't know about the evidence that would surface in 72 hours, buried in the train's maintenance logs, and the communications records of a man who sat 3 chairs from him at every family meeting. He didn't know that the landslide that brought the Ardmore Continental off its tracks above the gorge had not been entirely the work of weather and an aging track system. He didn't know any of that yet. What he knew, carrying his mother up a mountain path in the rain, was that something had broken open in him on this slope. Not broken badly. Broken the way things break when they've been sealed too long against something that needed to be let in. And that whatever came next was going to be decided not from behind the mahogany table, not from the position of the man who made others afraid, but from this place, this wet slope, this narrow path through the hollow, and the company he was keeping on it. The rain came down harder. Ahead of him, Caleb Ward kept moving. The hollow was warm. That was the first thing Victor registered when they brought his mother through the door of the community hall, a low, wide building at the center of Hallow Ford that appeared to function as whatever the community needed it to be on any given day. Tonight it was a field hospital. Cots had been pushed together from storage. Blankets appeared from somewhere, the kind that had been washed so many times the texture was more suggestion than material. A woman in her 60s who had the hands and the economy of movement of someone with medical training. Not a doctor, Victor would learn, but a nurse who had retired here 15 years ago and never left, moved between the survivors with a kit that was modest and organized and used without waste. Her name was Helen Pruitt. She had been awake since the crash was heard, which meant she had been awake for going on 7 hours, and she showed no indication that this was a condition requiring acknowledgement. They laid Evelyn's litter down on 2 pushed-together cots, and Helen came over immediately and started her assessment with quiet efficiency. Victor stood at the edge of the cot and watched and stayed out of the way, which was not his natural operating mode and which cost him something to maintain. "Wrist is fractured," Helen said, not to him, to herself, the way medical people narrate their own thinking. "Clean, I think. Needs imaging to confirm. Ribs. Breathe in for me, hun." "Evelyn," his mother said. "My name is Evelyn." Helen looked at her over the rim of her reading glasses. "Breathe in for me, Evelyn." His mother breathed in and didn't wince more than slightly, which was either a good sign about the rib or a sign about his mother, and Victor couldn't tell which. Around them, the rest of the rescued passengers were being tended to in various states of damage. The corporate attorney, her name turned out to be Sandra Oakes, was sitting on a cot with a blanket around her shoulders and a mug of something hot in both hands, and was staring at the wall with the expression of someone in the early stages of processing what had just happened to them. The older man from Carrefour, the one who'd been shaking badly, had been given 2 blankets and was now sleeping, which Helen had said was fine. The man with the leg injury, a retired banker named George Hale, who had been on the train with his wife, who had been in the front cars, was in the worst shape of anyone in the room, and Helen and a younger woman were working on his leg with what they had, and the particular focused calm of people who know that what they have is going to have to be enough. Victor's 4 men were outside. He'd sent them out to manage logistics, coordinate with Sal's team, which was now somewhere on the road below, work the phone lines, try again to get an ETA from the fire department rescue unit that was supposedly still coming. Give them something to do because there was nothing for them to do in here that these people weren't already doing. He found a wall and put his back against it and looked at his hands. The cut was on his right palm, not deep, the kind that bleeds significantly for its actual severity. Someone had wrapped it without asking him. He thought it had been Marcus, at some point on the path down, without breaking stride, just wrapped it with cloth torn from the bottom of his own shirt, tied it off, moved on. He hadn't said thank you. He filed that. Caleb came in from outside, shaking rain off his jacket. He crossed the room without looking at Victor, went directly to Helen, exchanged a few words Victor couldn't hear, looked at the leg injury situation, looked at George Hale sleeping, looked at the overall situation with the same assessment speed Victor had been watching him use all night. Then he came to the wall. He stood next to Victor and didn't say anything for a moment, just stood. Both of them looked at the room. "You have people coming," Caleb said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes. My operations manager and a team. They were about 90 minutes out when I last had contact." Victor checked his watch. That had been over an hour ago. "They'll be at the road checkpoint waiting for clearance." "They won't get clearance until the storm passes and the county assesses the road." "I know." "So your resources are on the other side of a mountain?" "Yes." Caleb was quiet for another moment. He had a graze on his jaw that he'd gotten at some point inside car 4 and hadn't bothered with. "The people in the front cars," he said. "The gorge." "I know." "We can't reach them until daylight. The creek's in flood, the gorge walls are... There's no safe approach until we can see." He said it the way someone says a thing they've already made themselves accept. "I've got 2 men down there maintaining position. Soon as there's light, we go." Victor nodded. He wasn't going to offer anything here because there was nothing to offer that was useful. What was in the gorge was beyond what resources could address tonight. It was one of those places where his particular kind of power went entirely quiet. "How many?" he said. The front 2 cars carried 12 passengers, 3 crew. Caleb said it flat. "We got positive voice contact with 2 people from the first car before the flooding got too loud to hear. After that, no contact." The room breathed around them. The rain on the roof was heavy, the second storm band, fully committed now, drumming the corrugated metal with a consistency that made conversation require a slight increase in volume. "You grew up here," Victor said. It wasn't the conversation he'd been planning to have. He hadn't been planning a conversation, but something in the room, in the situation, made the question come out. "Born here," Caleb said. "Hollow Ford in the mountain. My father was a mechanic. His father was a logger." He looked at the room without particular expression. "There were 200 people in this community when I was a kid. Now there's 63. The road the county was supposed to maintain got put on a deferred list in 2009 and has been deferred every year since. The school closed in 2014. He said none of this with anger, which was, in its way, more pointed than anger. "The mountain's still here. The creek's still here. The people who didn't leave are still here." "Why didn't you leave?" Victor said. Caleb looked at him for the first time since they'd come to the wall. The look carried something in it that wasn't hostility, but was related to hostility the way a closed door is related to a wall. "Same reason people do anything," he said. "It's home." Before Victor could respond, and he wasn't sure what he would have responded, the door to the community hall opened and 3 of Victor's men came in, led by Roland Greer, who was soaked through and carrying a bag that suggested he'd found a way through or around the checkpoint. Behind Roland were 2 faces Victor recognized from Sal's northeastern team, both of them looking at the community hall interior with the particular expression of city men who have arrived somewhere unexpected. Roland came directly to Victor. He had the look, that particular look, and Victor straightened off the wall. "What?" Victor said. "Sal's team reached the checkpoint an hour ago. County's not moving on the road until 6 a.m. minimum. Sal's managing that." Roland put the bag down and came in close, dropping his voice, which, given the rain on the roof, was probably unnecessary, but was the kind of habit that didn't get suspended. "I've been on the phone with legal, and with Peretti. Dominic Peretti, Victor's counsel for organizational matters, which was a particular category of legal work. The man who handled things that couldn't be handled through normal channels." "Why Peretti?" Victor said. Roland looked at him steadily. "Because there's something in the preliminary reports about the track section that failed. The maintenance records for that section of the line." He paused. The pause was the same kind of pause Sal had deployed on the phone, the one that meant the next thing was going to be bad. The track was flagged for inspection 8 months ago. Standard flag, routine, happens all the time on these old private rail lines. The Ardmore Company contracted the inspection to a third-party firm. Another pause. The inspection report that came back cleared the track. No action required. What's wrong with the inspection report? Victor said. Nothing on paper. But the firm that did it? Roland reached into his jacket and produced his phone and showed Victor the screen. The firm is a subsidiary of a holding company. The holding company has 11 investors. One of them is a name you're going to know. Victor looked at the screen. He looked at it for 5 seconds. The name was Thomas Cade. Thomas Cade, who had been at Victor's table for 8 years, who ran the Marcelli family's legitimate business portfolio. The real estate, the hospitality interests, the investment vehicles that made the whole operation function in daylight. Who had been, in the language Victor used with himself when he allowed himself to use language like this, the closest thing to a trusted partner that Victor's life permitted. Thomas Cade, who had been at the dinner 2 weeks ago when Evelyn Marcelli mentioned she was planning to take the Ardmore Continental to the family estate, and who had said, Victor could hear it now, the exact inflection, "What a good idea. The mountain air will do you good." The room was still. The rain was still doing its work on the roof. Helen Pruitt was still tending to George Hale's leg. Evelyn was watching her son from across the room with an expression that was trying to read the change in his face. Victor handed Roland back the phone. "Does Sal know?" he said. "Sal found it. He doesn't know what you want to do with it." "Does anyone else?" "Not yet." Victor looked at the floor of the community hall. Old wood, the kind that had been walked on for 50 years. The grain showing through where the finish had worn away in the traffic patterns. He looked at it the way you look at something neutral, when your mind is doing something that requires a neutral surface to work against. Thomas Cade had been sitting 3 chairs from him at every family meeting for 8 years, had attended Evelyn's birthday dinner last year and given her a gift, a book, he remembered, something about gardens. And she had thanked him warmly. Had told Victor 6 months ago that the family's power structure was becoming too dependent on Victor's personal relationships, that a distributed model would be more resilient. Victor had considered the point and not acted on it. He understood now that the conversation had not been advice. It had been reconnaissance. Evelyn's weakness, the leverage on Victor that everyone in his world knew about and most of them were too afraid to touch, was not a weakness Thomas Cade had decided to ignore. It was a weakness Thomas Cade had decided to use. "Keep it in this room," Victor said to Roland, very quietly. "You, me, Sal. No one else until I say." "Peretti." "Not yet. I'll call Peretti myself." He looked at Roland. "And not a word to any of the men about what this is. As far as they know, we're still in logistics mode. We're supporting the rescue. We're getting my mother stable. We're managing the situation." "Understood." Roland hesitated, which was rare. "What are we actually doing?" "We're thinking," Victor said, "carefully." Roland nodded and went back to the door, exchanging a quiet word with the men outside. Victor turned back toward the room and found that Caleb Ward was looking at him. Not at the exchange with Roland. Caleb had been across the room while that happened. But at Victor's face now, at whatever was currently on it. Caleb had the look of a man who has read weather long enough to recognize the change in pressure before the change becomes visible. He didn't ask. He just looked, for a moment, and then went back to what he'd been doing. Victor crossed to his mother's cot. She was propped up on a folded blanket, her wrapped wrist resting on her lap, her face carrying the particular kind of tiredness that is not just physical, the kind that accumulates when adrenaline drains, and what's underneath it is the knowledge of how close something came. She looked at him when he crouched beside her, and she didn't bother with her usual composure. There wasn't enough energy left for it. "Something's wrong," she said. "More than the train. Don't. Victor, you need to rest. Your wrist needs—" "My wrist is broken, and my rib hurts when I breathe deeply, and I've been sitting in a crashed train for 6 hours. And something just happened to your face that I have not seen on your face since your father's arrest." She held his eyes. "What is it?" He looked at her, the woman who ironed shirts in the kitchen on Della Street, who had known, at some level he was only now beginning to understand, exactly what she was raising and had raised it anyway, with her whole self, without apology or revision. "There's information coming through about the track failure," he said. He chose each word specifically. "I need to verify it before I know what it means." She read him. She read him the way she had always read him, all the way through the parts he was presenting to the surface and down into the parts he was managing. Someone did this, she said. I don't know yet. Victor. I don't know yet, he said again, and this time it was true in the way that things are true when you need them to stay uncertain for a little longer, when the alternative to uncertainty is a decision you're not ready to have made yet. She held his eyes for another moment, and then she looked away, which was not surrender, but its own kind of mercy. Tell me when you know, she said. The storm peaked around 5 a.m. and then started to pull back, not graciously, but with the reluctant, gradual quality of violence that has said most of what it wanted to say. By 5:30, the rain on the roof had shifted from its sustained roar to something more intermittent, and by 5:45, Caleb was at the door looking at the sky with the expression of someone reading a language that isn't spoken. 40 minutes, he said to Victor, who had come to stand beside him. Maybe 30. He meant to the gorge, to what was in it. Victor nodded. Behind them, the community hall had settled into an exhausted, functional quiet. 3 of the rescued passengers were sleeping. Sandra Oakes had finally stopped staring at the wall and was talking, quietly, to a young woman from the village who had brought her more of the hot drink and had sat down with her and apparently had enough patience and enough of the particular quality of simple human presence that Sandra needed to be able to say out loud what she'd been alone with all night. Victor watched this for a moment. The young woman, maybe 22, 23, was not a counselor, was not trained in any of the things that word implies. She was just there, fully there, the way people from this hollow seemed to be full in ways he was only starting to catalog. Marcus came in from outside, still wearing the damp clothes he'd worked in all night. He crossed to a folding table against the wall where someone had set up coffee in a large industrial urn, the kind you use when you're feeding a community, and poured himself a cup and drank half of it standing, then poured another and brought it across the room to George Hale, who had woken up and was lying with his eyes open in the expression of a man trying to take stock of what remains. No one told Marcus to do that. Victor watched him do it on his own initiative, without a thought, as if it were simply the obvious thing. He turned back to Caleb. "Your nephew," he said. Caleb glanced back at Marcus. "Yeah." "How old?" 17, 18 in March. "He work with you regularly." Caleb looked at him with the closed-door quality again, a little more pronounced. "He works with the community. That's what people here do when something needs doing." He looked back at the sky. "He wants to be an engineer, civil engineering, he told me last year. He's been doing his courses online because the closest school that has a proper program is 60 miles, and there's no reliable transport to get there. He said it the same way he'd said everything else about the Hollow, not as complaint, as weather report. He's good, better than good. He understands load dynamics intuitively. Tonight, when we were assessing Car 4, he read the physics before I articulated it. I was still working through the calculation, and he said, 'The ledge is the anchor. We use the cable as secondary,' and he was right." Victor said nothing. 60 miles, Caleb said. No transport. That's the difference between Marcus building bridges and Marcus being 35 in this hollow, wondering what else his life might have been. He turned and looked at Victor directly. Not because he didn't try, not because he wasn't capable, because of 60 miles and no reliable transport. Victor held the look. He understood that this was not small talk. He understood that nothing Caleb Ward said was small talk. "Caleb?" One of the village men appeared in the doorway, mid-40s, a face that had worked outdoors for 20 years. "Gorge path's passable. Danny and Ruiz are at the base already." Caleb was moving before the man finished the sentence. The gorge in early light was different from the gorge at night. Not better. The daylight made it more specific, which was not the same as more bearable. The creek was still high, running fast and brown with everything the storm had moved, and the wreckage of the first 2 cars was visible now in ways it hadn't been in the dark. Victor stood at the base of the gorge wall with 4 of Caleb's people and 2 of his own men, and looked at what the creek had done and what the fall had done. And he was a man who had seen violence and its aftermath in many forms, and this was different in the specific way that scale is always different from the individual. Caleb moved through the site without stopping, checking, assessing, directing the people with him in the efficient shorthand of established teamwork. Victor followed and stayed out of the way, and kept his face controlled and managed what he was looking at by treating it as information, which was the only management technique available to him that worked. They found 2 survivors, a couple in their 50s, Leonard and Maria Vasquez, who had been in the last compartment of the first car when it went off the track, and who had survived because the first car had jackknifed on impact rather than rolling straight, and their compartment had ended up wedged against a boulder rather than in the creek. They'd been in that space for 8 hours, in the dark, with the creek rising around them. Leonard had a dislocated shoulder and 3 broken fingers. Maria was, physically, nearly uninjured, which was information her expression made no use of. When they brought them out, carefully, through the creek shallows, supported on either side, Maria Vasquez looked up at the wreckage above her, and then at the people who had come down to get them, and she said, in a voice that had been through something, "We heard people calling for us. Last night. Through the metal." She looked at Caleb. "That was you." "Some of us," Caleb said. "The water was loud. We couldn't tell if—" "We heard you," she said. "We just couldn't get to where you could hear back." She was still looking at him with an expression that was trying to find the right shape. "We kept each other awake. We told each other someone was up there." Caleb nodded once. No speech. No reception of the gratitude in the way that gratitude is usually received. He just turned and pointed up the gorge wall toward the path and said, "Let's get you warm." They didn't find the others. That was the truth of it, and by 8 a.m. it was clear and stated, not dramatized, simply a fact laid down alongside all the other facts of the night. Of the 43 people on the Ardmore Continental, 31 had survived. The 12 who hadn't were in the gorge, and the recovery of them would require equipment and time and the official presence of people whose job it was. And Caleb's people had done what they could do and had known, since midnight, what the math was probably going to be. Victor stood at the edge of the gorge path and understood that there was nothing his money had been able to do about those 12 people. Not because it hadn't arrived. Some of it was here now. Sal's team had made it through the road by 7 a.m. with equipment that was state-of-the-art and resources that could move mountains in the literal sense. But because the window had closed before the resources arrived, the window had opened and closed in the same 6 hours when the only people moving were the people from Hallow Ford, with their ropes and their hand jacks, and their knowledge of the mountain path. Sal Ferretti arrived at the community hall at 8:15 with 3 men and the expression of someone who has been holding a significant piece of information for hours and is ready to be relieved of it. Victor took him outside. The morning was cold and gray, the storm done but its atmosphere still present, and they stood behind the community hall near the woodpile where no one from inside could see them. "Tell me what else you have," Victor said. Sal was 51, a solid man who had been with the Marcelli operation since before Victor took over, who had outlasted the transition through a combination of genuine competence and the specific loyalty that comes from having no viable life outside the organization you've committed to. He reached into his coat and produced a folded printout. "Thomas Cade moved money 3 weeks ago," he said. "A transfer out of the Second Development Fund. 7 figures. It went through 4 shells before we lost the thread. But the origination is clean. It's his authority, his authentication. I had Peretti's guy pull the internal transaction logs." He handed Victor the printout. "The transfer date is 9 days before the train was scheduled." Victor looked at the paper. Numbers and account codes, the language of money moved carefully. He'd read enough of these to understand what he was looking at without needing it explained. 9 days, he said. Prepositioning. Moving assets before whatever was going to happen changed the landscape. Sal was choosing his words with care. "Victor, if the track inspection was compromised and the transfer happened 9 days prior, I know what it means, Sal. There's more." Sal looked at him steadily. "Kate has been in contact with 2 of the family council members, separately, not in any meeting context, private dinners, private calls. I have records on both contacts. One goes back 4 months, one goes back 7. 4 months, 7 months. Victor ran the math backward through every meeting, every decision, every moment in the last 7 months where he'd said something in front of Thomas Cade that was true and private and that Cade had now apparently been carrying somewhere else. "Which council members?" Victor said. Sal told him. Both names landed with their own specific weight. One was a surprise. The other was a man Victor had known for 15 years, who had stood at his father's funeral with an expression that Victor had always interpreted as genuine grief. He folded the printout and put it in his jacket. The theory that had been forming since Roland showed him the screen last night now had its structure complete. Thomas Cade had concluded that Victor's empire was too dependent on Victor's personal authority, that the removal of the one person Victor would genuinely compromise himself to protect would create a window for reorganization. For the council members who had been listening to Cade's alternative vision for 4 to 7 months to step into positions of influence while Victor was, grieving, destabilized, absent from the table while he dealt with the personal catastrophe that Cade had arranged to happen on a mountain track 8 months in the making. It was in the abstract, well-constructed, clean. The kind of plan that looked like an accident because it was built on an accident. A track failure, a storm, a train. Natural causes, nobody's hands in it directly, except for the inspection firm, except for the holding company, except for the shell transfer that moved 7 figures 9 days prior, except for the fact that his mother had survived. "Where is Cade right now?" Victor said. "City. As far as we can tell, he's been at his apartment since last night. Our people put him there at 11 p.m. Sal paused. "He called Roland this morning, asked for an update on your mother." Victor was quiet. That's a specific kind of move," Sal said carefully. "Yes," Victor said. "It is. A man who had arranged for something to happen and then called to ask after the victim. Either a performance of innocence so committed it had become its own pathology, or a man who had done something catastrophic and was compulsively monitoring the outcome, the way people return to scenes not because they're bold, but because the uncertainty is unbearable." "What did Roland tell him?" Victor said. "That she was stable. Basic information." "Good." Victor looked at the mountain above the community hall, at the gray sky and the wet trees and the path that went up into the hollow. "Don't move on Cade. Don't surveil him in any way that he could detect. Nobody talks to the council members. Nobody adjusts anything. Everything stays exactly as it was." "Victor, he thinks it didn't work," Victor said. "He's running on incomplete information. My mother is alive, but he doesn't know what we know and what we don't know. That gap is the only thing I want him to have right now." Sal nodded slowly. "For how long?" Victor looked at the community hall. Through the window he could see Caleb Ward at the folding table, talking to 2 of his people over coffee. The easy posture of a man in a room he belongs to completely. He could see Marcus on a cot nearby, finally sleeping, his work jacket still on, 1 boot off and 1 boot on. He could see his mother, propped up, talking to Helen Pruitt, with the expression she got when she was actually interested in someone. Leaned slightly forward, eye contact direct, the expression that was not performance. "Long enough," Victor said. "I need to do something first." He went back inside. He found Caleb at the table and sat down across from him without preamble. Caleb looked at him and waited. "I need to ask you something," Victor said. "All right." "Last night, when I asked you what you need," Victor stopped, started again. "You didn't hesitate. You knew exactly what you needed, and you told me, and you assumed I'd deliver it." He looked at the table. "Nobody talks to me like that." Caleb considered this for a moment. "How do people usually talk to you?" Carefully. "Yeah." Caleb turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Well, I didn't need anything from you except what you could actually do. Seemed like a waste of time to approach it any other way." "You knew who I was, what I am." "I did. And it didn't—" "Your money couldn't get your mother off that mountain," Caleb said. The words were not gentle, but they weren't weaponized. They were just accurate. "Your reputation couldn't. Your men weren't going to do it faster than my people did. So what were you, at that site, besides someone with a strong back and a reason to care?" He looked at Victor directly. "That's all I needed you to be." Victor sat with that. He had not, in a very long time, been reduced to those 2 things, a strong back and a reason to care, and found that the reduction, rather than diminishing him, had produced something. He wasn't sure what to call it yet. He sat with it. "I want to talk to you," Victor said. About this community, about what's needed. After all of this is... He gestured at the room, the situation, the everything. I want to have that conversation. Caleb looked at him steadily. People have offered things to this community before. County officials, developers, a couple of politicians who came through when it was useful for a photo. He said it without bitterness. Straight reporting. They offered. It didn't become anything. I know. So what makes... I know, Victor said. I'm not making the offer now. I'm telling you I want to have the conversation. When we're past the immediate situation, when you can see clearly whether I mean it. He held Caleb's eyes. You'll be able to tell. Caleb studied him for a long moment, the same assessment he'd been making all night. Then he nodded once. All right, he said. The fire department technical rescue team arrived at 9:47 a.m., 4 hours behind schedule, with equipment and personnel that would have been enormously useful the night before. Their team leader, a man named Brock, assessed the site with the systematic competence of someone doing his job well, and his job was the kind where you arrived at the aftermath and documented it and made safe what needed making safe and recovered what needed recovering. He found Caleb's operations already complete. He found 31 survivors. He found a community that had been doing his job for 12 hours before he got there. He looked at Caleb with something that Victor, watching from the edge of the room, recognized as the expression that professionals have when they encounter competence in a place they weren't expecting it. You moved the survivors, Brock said, from the cars. We did, without structural assessment. We made structural assessments, Caleb said. We didn't use the official forms. Brock looked at him for a moment. You're going to get written up for some of this. Liability questions. I imagine, Caleb said. He didn't sound concerned. A man who had made peace with the transaction. Victor stepped forward. Whatever liability questions arise from the rescue operation, he said to Brock, route them to my legal team. Here. He produced a card. Not because the card was how he operated, but because it was the fastest legible shorthand for what he was saying. Those questions are handled. Brock took the card and looked at it, and then looked at Victor with the recognition that had been shifting across every unfamiliar face Victor had encountered for years. Marcelli. Yes. Brock looked at the card again, back at Victor. Made a decision that was visible in the settling of his expression. Understood, he said. Caleb looked at Victor after Brock moved away. Not gratitude exactly. Caleb seemed to process gratitude differently than most people, as information rather than emotion. But something. You didn't have to do that, Caleb said. I know, Victor said. His phone rang. He looked at the screen and something in him went very still. It was Thomas Cade. Not a text. A call. A direct call to Victor's personal line, 10:02 in the morning, from the man who had arranged to put his mother on a train that was built to fail. The phone rang in his hand and Victor stood in the middle of the community hall of Hallow Ford with 31 survivors around him and the phone getting warmer in his grip, and he looked at Caleb Ward one more time, at the face of the man who had moved toward the disaster rather than away from it, who had made decisions under pressure without the safety net of power or resources, who had said, "We've got you through a window to a woman in the dark." And he answered the call. "Thomas," he said, and his voice came out exactly right. Level, warm, the voice of a man who knows nothing. "Victor." Cade's voice, on the other end, was doing what voices do when they're performing relief. "Thank God. Roland told me she's stable. She's stable," Victor said. "She's good." He turned slightly away from the room. "It was a long night." "Victor, I can't imagine. I've been up since the news came through. I tried to reach you." "The mountain," Victor said. "No signal." Of course. Listen, what do you need? I can be there in 4 hours. I can bring..." "Don't," Victor said. He kept his voice warm, kept everything in it except the truth. "Stay in the city. I need someone managing things there while I'm dealing with this. Can you do that?" A pause. Very brief. The pause of someone receiving an answer that is not the expected answer and checking it for meaning. "Of course," Cade said. "Whatever you need." "I'll call you when we're heading back," Victor said. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow. Take whatever time you need. Another warmth performance. She's what matters. Yes, Victor said. She is. He ended the call. He stood for a moment with the phone in his hand and looked at the community hall wall, at the old wood and the worn finish, and he made a decision that was not a decision about Thomas Cade. The decision about Thomas Cade had already been made, somewhere between the gorge and the dark and this phone call. The architecture of it was clear and would not change. The decision he made in that moment was about what came after, about what the accounting looked like, about who paid what and how, and whether payment was the right word for it at all. He put the phone in his pocket. Across the room, his mother was watching him. She had seen the call. She had watched his face during it with the attention of someone who reads faces the way other people read text. Fluently, automatically, taking in the whole of it. He crossed to her. He sat down on the edge of the cot and looked at her, and for once, for the first time in longer than he could accurately calculate, he didn't manage his face. He let her see what was on it. She looked at him for a long time. It was deliberate, she said. Not a question. Yes. Someone inside. Yes. She absorbed this in the way she absorbed serious information, quietly, with her whole self, not rushing toward a response. She looked at her wrapped wrist for a moment. Then she looked back at him. Are you going to do what you always do? She said. He held her eyes. No, he said. She searched his face for the truth of that word and apparently found something that satisfied her because she nodded slowly. Outside, somewhere on the path above the hollow, Victor could hear the fire department team beginning their secondary operations, the machinery of official response finally arriving to process what had already been resolved by 63 people and one night, and the particular quality of people who moved toward the problem. The decision had been made. There was no version of the future where he could pretend it hadn't. But what the decision meant, what it required of him, not just to Thomas Cade but to the council members, to the organization, to the man he'd been building himself into for 21 years, and the other man who seemed to be standing in the community hall of Hallow Ford with mud on his face and someone else's cloth wrapped around his hand, that was still forming. The point he could not come back from had arrived while he was on the phone performing warmth to the man who'd tried to kill his mother, and he hadn't felt it arrive. Not as a dramatic thing, not as a choice with weight and moment. He just heard himself say no, and meant it, and that was already everything. The drive back to the city took 4 hours, and Victor spent most of it in silence. Evelyn was in the second vehicle, stretched across the rear seat with her wrapped wrist elevated on a folded jacket, Helen Pruitt's instructions about elevation and ice intervals written on a card that Victor had put in his breast pocket like a document requiring safekeeping. The county hospital in Millhaven had done imaging, confirmed the wrist fracture, confirmed one cracked rib, cleared her for transport. The attending physician had used the word fortunate 3 times in 5 minutes, and Victor had nodded each time without processing it. Roland was driving. The 2 men from Sal's team were in the trailing vehicle with Evelyn. Victor sat in the passenger seat and looked at the road coming at them and thought about architecture, not buildings, the other kind, the kind you build over years inside an organization, the relationships, the dependencies, the lines of trust that are actually lines of obligation wearing trust's clothing. He'd been building that architecture since he was 22, inheriting his father's half-collapsed structure and rebuilding it from the foundation. And he'd believed, with the particular confidence of someone who has been proven right enough times, that he understood it completely. Thomas Cade had been inside that architecture for 8 years, which meant Victor had been wrong about something for 8 years. And the specific thing he'd been wrong about had cost 31 people a night on a mountain and 12 people everything. He did not permit himself to feel the full weight of that yet. Full weight now was not useful. He needed the weight in manageable portions, the way you move something heavy. Not all at once. Roland, he said. Yeah. The council meeting scheduled for Thursday. Still on the books. Keep it there. Don't move anything. Victor watched a highway overpass pass above them. Who confirmed attendance? Roland ran through the list from memory. All 7 council members, including the 2 names Sal had given him behind the community hall. Victor listened to the names in sequence and assigned each one a mental position, The way you position pieces before a movie. Cade? Roland said at the end. Yes, Victor said. He confirmed Thursday morning, before the train news broke. Victor looked at the highway. Pre-confirmed, which meant the meeting was already in Cade's calendar as a significant date before the accident he'd arranged occurred. Pre-positioned, like the money. Everything pre-positioned. A man who had been living two lives inside the same skin for 8 months and had apparently found it manageable. Victor wondered, with a cold and specific curiosity, what that actually felt like. To sit 3 chairs from someone at a table, to eat food in their house, to ask after their mother with a voice made of performance, and to have underneath all of it the knowledge of what you'd put in motion. He wondered whether Cade had compartmentalized it cleanly. The professional calculation in one room, the human relationship in another, doors between them. Or whether it had leaked, the way things always leak, in small ways that Victor had seen and not read correctly. He cataloged the last 8 months, every meeting, every dinner, every phone call that had carried Cade's voice. He was looking for the moments that should have read differently. He found 4. They were small moments. He'd attributed them to fatigue, to business pressure, to the ordinary friction that any long professional relationship accumulated. He'd been too confident. That was the truth underneath the other truths. He'd been running an organization built on the premise that his judgment about people was reliable, and he'd been wrong about the person sitting closest to him, and 31 people had survived a mountain and 12 had not, and his mother had broken her wrist and cracked a rib, and all of it could be drawn back to one root. He had been too confident. He filed that. Not as self-punishment. Self-punishment was another form of uselessness, but as information that would change the operating parameters going forward. They reached the city at 2 in the afternoon. Victor brought his mother directly to the Marcelli family residence, a townhouse in the northern part of the city that had been in the family since his grandfather, that Evelyn had lived in for 40 years, and that Victor had taken over the security and maintenance of, and that she referred to, always, as my house rather than the house, a distinction that Victor had always honored without comment. He got her settled. He managed the logistics of her care with the same focused efficiency he applied to everything. Arranged for a private physician, arranged for the particular sparkling water she preferred, arranged for the specific kind of quiet that his mother's recovery was going to require. He sat with her for 20 minutes while the physician completed the examination, and then he went downstairs and into the study and closed the door. Sal was already there. Peretti was on the phone screen, his face carrying the particular composure of a man who handles crises professionally and has been doing so long enough that composure is no longer an act. "We need to talk about how we move," Victor said. "Before we get to that," Peretti said from the screen, "there's something you need to hear." The something took 4 minutes to lay out. Peretti delivered it in the flat, sequential manner of someone who has organized complicated information and knows that the way it lands depends entirely on the order. The track inspection. The holding company with Thomas Cade as one of 11 investors. Peretti's investigator had spent the morning going further into the holding company's structure, past the surface level that had produced Cade's name. There were 11 investors, as Roland had said. What hadn't been clear the night before, because Peretti's investigator had still been working the records, was that the 11 investors were not equals. The holding company had a managing partner, a position that carried controlling authority over the firm's contracting decisions, including the decision to take on the Ardmore rail inspection contract and the decision about what that inspection report was going to say. The managing partner was not Thomas Cade. Cade owned a minority stake, 14%, not controlling, not directing, a passenger in the vehicle rather than the driver. Victor stood very still. "The managing partner," he said. Peretti looked at him through the screen with the expression of someone doing the professional equivalent of bracing. "Raymond Lusk," Peretti said. The name did not produce a visible reaction in Victor's body. His body had been trained against visible reactions for 20 years, but something happened behind his eyes, something that Roland, standing near the window, noticed and then looked away from. Raymond Lusk was 64 years old. He had been the Marcelli family's primary liaison with the legitimate financial sector for 19 years. He was not a council member. He declined that kind of formal organizational role consistently, which Victor had always interpreted as the preference of a man who valued his professional independence. He sat outside the council structure, which meant he was outside the circle of people Victor had been thinking about since Sal produced those names the night before. He sat outside the circle, and he had controlling authority over the firm that had produced the false inspection report, and he had been connected to the Ardmore rail contract for 8 months, and Victor had spent the last 12 hours constructing a complete and coherent theory of the betrayal with Thomas Cade at its center. The theory had just lost its center. "What's Cade's position?" Victor said. His voice was level. The levelness was costing him something. Cade knew about the holding company. He's in it. He's been in it for 3 years. It's a legitimate investment vehicle on his end. It generates return on a portfolio of rail and infrastructure properties. Reddy paused. Whether he knew what Lusk was doing with the inspection contract, whether the 14% stake came with information about that specific decision, we don't know yet. My investigator is still pulling the communication records. The money transfer Sal found, 7 figures, 9 days prior. That transfer originated from an account under Cade's authority, yes. Peretti's voice was careful. But the destination account, we've got further into the shell chain. The final destination is a holding structure that traces back to Lusk's personal investment network. Not Cade's. Victor turned and looked at the wall. He looked at a painting his father had chosen. Something dark and European that he'd never liked and never replaced. He looked at it for 5 seconds. "Cade moved Lusk's money," he said. "That appears to be what the transaction record is showing. Whether he did it knowingly or under some other arrangement, a favor, a routine financial management service, we're not there yet. Get there." "Working on it." Victor turned back to the room. "Where's Lusk?" Sal answered this one. "His residence in the city as of this morning. He called the office here twice while you were on the mountain. Routine calls, according to the staff, asking after the situation with your mother. Normal concern." Sal said the words with the particular flatness of someone who finds them extraordinary. "He's been visible. No indication he's moved anything or gone anywhere." 19 years. Raymond Lusk had been in the perimeter of the Marcelli operation for 19 years, which was 4 years before Victor took over from his father, which meant Lusk had evaluated both men and had decided, at some point in the last 8 months, that Victor was the problem rather than the solution. Had decided to arrange for the removal of the leverage point, Evelyn, and had used a man inside Victor's trusted circle to move the capital and had structured the holding company to keep his own name at the third layer of the architecture, behind 11 investors and a corporate identity. Clean, organized, patient. Victor thought about patience, about what it took to maintain a plan across 8 months, across 19 years of a relationship, across every meeting and dinner and phone call in which you performed loyalty while holding the plan. He thought about the call that morning, standing in Hallow Ford's community hall with mud on his face, saying Thomas in his warmest voice. He'd been performing toward the wrong person. He'd told Cade to stay in the city, to manage things while Victor dealt with the mountain situation. He'd given Cade a position of operational authority based on a theory that Cade was the architect of the betrayal. Cade was now somewhere in the city managing things, with access to the organization's operational communications, because Victor had asked him to. "Get me Cade," Victor said. Sal pulled out his phone. Not by phone. Victor moved toward the door. "In person. Here. Within the hour." "Victor." "Within the hour, Sal." Thomas Cade arrived in 52 minutes, which said something about how seriously he was taking Victor's summons, which in turn said something about where Cade believed he stood in the current situation. He came in through the residence's private entrance and was shown to the study, and Victor was already there, standing by the window, when Cade came through the door. Cade was 55, silver-haired, the kind of man who moved through expensive rooms as though he'd been manufactured for them. He had the face of someone who managed things, organized, watchful, performing warmth as a professional instrument. He'd been doing it for 8 years in Victor's company, and Victor had read it as the face of a partner. He came into the room and saw Victor, and his expression did several things quickly. Relief first, a man seeing his associate alive and present after a crisis, or the performance of that. Then something more complex, a reading of the room, of Victor's posture at the window, of the fact that Sal was present and Roland was near the door and Peretti was gone from the screen, but a laptop sat open on the desk. Victor. He crossed the room and put his hand out. Victor shook it. He shook it with the same warmth the handshake was offered with and watched Cade's face for the micro-adjustment that came when the expected emotional register wasn't present. There, a fraction of recalibration behind the eyes. "Sit down, Thomas," Victor said. They sat across from each other at the desk, and Victor put his hands flat on the surface and looked at Thomas Cade and took the full measure of him in the way he should have been taking the full measure of him for 8 years. "I need to ask you about the Ardmore rail investment," Victor said. Cade was good. The composure barely moved. "Which investment?" I manage several infrastructure positions." "The holding company, the one with the rail maintenance subsidiary." Cade looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Keystone Rail Holdings." "Yes." "Victor, I've disclosed all my personal investment positions to your legal team. If there's a conflict question—" "Raymond Lusk," Victor said. Cade stopped. It was a small stop. Not a flinch, not a visible break, but the particular stillness of someone whose internal activity has suddenly increased beyond what the surface can fully conceal. "He's the managing partner of the holding company," Victor said. "You own 14%. He has controlling authority. Tell me about that arrangement." "I've known Raymond for years. He brought me into the investment as a limited partner. It's a clean investment, Victor. There's nothing. Did you know he contracted Keystone's subsidiary for the Ardmore Continental track inspection?" Cade looked at him. "No, I don't have visibility into the individual contracts the firm takes on. That's not how a limited partnership—" "Did you move money on his behalf 9 days before the train?" Now the composure shifted. Not dramatically, but the thing behind the composure, the calculation, became briefly visible, like a light source seen through a wall. 1 second, maybe less. Then the surface came back. "I manage financial movements for a number of associates," Cade said. "It's part of what I do for the—" "Thomas." Victor let the word sit. "I'm not asking you to confess something. I'm asking you to tell me exactly what you knew and when you knew it. And I'm asking you right now in this room, before this becomes something else." Cade looked at him. The performance of warmth was fully gone now. Not replaced by hostility, replaced by something more honest, which was calculation without the coding. "I moved the money," Cade said. "Raymond asked me to route a transfer through the development fund. He said it was a property acquisition, time-sensitive. He needed it moved quietly. He stopped. "I didn't ask what for." "You didn't ask what for." "I've moved money for Raymond before. It's not unusual for our—" "7 figures, Victor said. 9 days before a train carrying my mother went off the track." Silence. Cade's hands, resting on the desk, were very still. The stillness of conscious control. "I didn't know about the train," he said. "Victor, I swear to you, I didn't know what the money was for. I didn't know about the inspection contract. I didn't know any of—" "Stop swearing things to me." Victor's voice didn't raise. It went in the other direction, quieter, which in this room was worse than volume. "I need to know if you're telling me the truth, or if you're telling me the most useful version of the truth. Those are 2 different things, and I need to know which one this is." Cade looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through his face. Not guilt exactly, but the cousin of guilt that arrives when a person understands, fully and finally, the exact shape of the situation they are in. "I didn't know about the train," he said. "That's the truth. I moved the money because Raymond asked, and I didn't look at it closely enough. That is also the truth, and I understand what that means, and I'm not going to—" He stopped again. Started more carefully. "I'm not going to ask you to believe that ignorance is the same as innocence." Victor sat with that. It was for Thomas Cade an unusually honest sentence. "Where is Raymond Lusk right now?" Victor said. "I don't know. I haven't spoken to him since before the mountain." "Think carefully." "Victor, I haven't—" Victor's phone rang. He looked at the screen. It was Sal's secondary line, which meant it was coming from the surveillance team Sal had quietly positioned on Lusk's residence that morning. He answered. The voice on the other end was one of Sal's men, and he said 4 words. "He's not here anymore." Victor stood up from the desk. "When?" he said into the phone. "We set up on the residence at 11. He was inside then. Concierge confirmed he'd signed for a delivery at 10:40. At 12:15, the concierge says he left through the building's service exit. Car was waiting. We missed it. We were positioned on the main entrance." "The car?" "No plates. Dark sedan, city traffic ate it." Victor put the phone in his pocket. He looked at Cade across the desk. Cade had heard enough of the call to understand what it meant, and the understanding was on his face without any of the coding. "He ran," Cade said, very quietly. "Yes." "Victor, he knew my mother survived," Victor said. He wasn't talking to Cade now. He was talking to the room, working it out in words because the speed of it required external processing. He's been monitoring. He knows the rescue was successful. He's been waiting to see what surfaces. The inspection records, the holding company, the transfer. He turned toward the door. He made a decision about when the information would reach me. He calculated the window. And miscalculated, which was the one thing about Raymond Lusk that Victor was, in this moment, genuinely grateful for. He went through the door and down the hall into the secondary office where the operational systems were. And Sal was already there and already moving, because Sal had heard the same call and didn't need instruction to begin doing what needed doing. "Airports," Victor said. "Already on it. I've got people at Meridian and at the private terminal at Holt Field. If he goes commercial or charters, he won't go commercial. He won't charter under his own name." Victor stood at the operational board, the screens and communications infrastructure of the kind that didn't exist in any official record. He has money moved. He's been planning for a contingency. That means he has a route that doesn't touch his name. Then how? Raymond Lusk is 64 years old and he has been doing business in this city for 30 years, Victor said. He didn't build a clean escape route in a vacuum. He has people. People who owe him things, who have managed things for him, who know things. He turned to Roland. Who are his people? Not his business contacts. His people, the ones he actually trusts. Roland thought. It was a different kind of thinking from logistics thinking, reaching further back into the texture of the years. "There's a man," Roland said slowly. "Geller. Paul Geller. He and Lusk go back to before the organization. College, I think. He runs a transport logistics company in the Port District. Low profile. Raymond's referred business to him over the years. Address." Sal was already pulling it. The Port District was 40 minutes in traffic and 25 with Roland driving the way Roland drove when Victor gave him a specific destination and a specific urgency. They went south through the city, through the commercial districts and the warehouse corridors and the industrial stretches where the city's wealth was processed rather than displayed. And Victor sat in the passenger seat and looked at his phone and looked at the contact list and found the number he'd been avoiding. He called the number. It rang twice, and then a voice answered that was professionally careful in the way of law enforcement, which was exactly what it was. His name was Connolly. Deputy Director Connolly, Federal Organized Crime Division, and he had been in an arrangement with Victor Marcelli for 3 years that neither of them discussed openly and both of them used selectively, and that lived in the specific gray space between law and organization that such arrangements always occupy. "I need information on Raymond Lusk," Victor said without preamble. "And I need to know if there's anything federal on him that I don't know about." Silence on the line. The silence of someone deciding how to respond to a request that falls outside the normal parameters of their arrangement. "This is an unusual ask," Connolly said. "Yes." "You want to tell me the context?" "No." Another pause. Then, "Give me 20 minutes." Victor gave him 20 minutes. They arrived at the Port District address for Paul Geller's logistics company, a converted warehouse with a working yard full of transport containers and the particular organized chaos of a functional freight operation. And Sal went inside while Victor waited at the vehicle, and Roland stood nearby doing what Roland did, which was to be present in a way that communicated specific information to anyone considering approaching. Sal came back in 8 minutes. His face had the look. "Geller was here this morning," Sal said. His office manager says he left just before noon for what he described as a personal situation. Didn't say where. Hasn't been back. The same window, Victor said. Lusk and Geller moved in the same window. He looked at the harbor, visible beyond the warehouse yard. The gray water and the container ships and the cranes, the working machinery of a port city that moved things from here to elsewhere as its fundamental business. His phone rang. Connolly. Raymond Lusk, Connolly said, with the voice of someone reading from something just retrieved, has been a person of interest to 2 federal financial investigations in the last 4 years. Both were closed without charges. He has a secondary residence registered in his wife's maiden name in a coastal community about 200 miles north. He also, a pause that wasn't hesitation, was preparation. He also has an active cooperation agreement with the Federal Organized Crime Task Force, has had one for 6 years. Victor stopped moving. What kind of cooperation agreement, he said, and his voice came out very carefully, the way you carry something that cannot be dropped. Informant agreement, Connolly said. The Marcelli family's legitimate financial operations. He's been providing documentation on the investment structures, the business portfolio, the legal side management. It goes back 6 years. 6 years. Not 8 months. Not since he started planning the train. 6 years of sitting inside the Marcelli organization's legitimate financial infrastructure, having access to everything Victor had been building in the daylight. The clean money, the legal entities, the investment vehicles that were supposed to be the future, and providing it systematically to the federal task force. For 6 years. Victor stood in the port district with the harbor visible behind him and the logistics warehouse in front of him and the phone against his ear, and he did the math that the number 6 years required. In 6 years, the federal task force would have documentation on every legal entity the Marcelli organization had built, every investment structure, every property acquisition, every financial vehicle that Victor had constructed specifically to move the family away from the criminal base and toward something that could exist in daylight. Every bridge he'd been building between what the family was and what he'd wanted it to become. Lusk hadn't just arranged for Evelyn's accident. He'd been dismantling the organization's future from the inside for 6 years, feeding it to a federal investigation that could activate whenever the task force decided the documentation was sufficient. Connolly, Victor said. Your task force, the Marcelli investigation, what's its current status? A pause that was the longest Connolly had allowed himself. Victor, you understand what you're asking me. I understand exactly what I'm asking you. I can't. You can. You have. We've been in an arrangement for 3 years that has benefited your task force significantly. I'm asking for one piece of information in return for 3 years of benefit. The pause this time was different. Longer. The pause of someone doing genuine calculation. The investigation, Connolly said quietly, is in the documentation phase. No action has been initiated. The task force has been building the file. How close, Victor said. I don't know specifics. I'm not on that team. He stopped. Then, very quietly. But the file I know of from my side of the building, the Marcelli legal portfolio documentation, if that's representative of what they have, they're not far. Victor ended the call. He stood for a moment and didn't move. 6 years of documents, every clean thing he'd built, the entire architecture of the future he'd been constructing, the legitimate businesses, the investment portfolio, the slow, deliberate exit ramp from the criminal base that he'd been building at the same time as he was running the criminal base, the long, patient project of becoming something else. Lusk had been photographing the blueprints and handing them to the people who would eventually use them to bring the whole structure down. He hadn't just tried to remove Evelyn. He'd been working on a timeline. The train was the accelerator. Create a crisis, destabilize Victor, cause the chaos that would bring the council into play, and give the men Lusk had been cultivating the space to move. And simultaneously, signal to the federal task force that the organization was entering a vulnerable moment. A coordinated collapse from 2 directions. And Lusk was now in a car without plates, moving toward a coastal community 200 miles north, or toward Paul Geller's boat, or toward some route that Lusk had been maintaining for years because a man who is conducting a 6-year operation inside a criminal organization, knows that operations end and that the end requires preparation. Roland was watching Victor's face. "We need to move," Victor said. "Where?" "The coastal residence Connolly mentioned, 200 miles north." He turned toward the vehicle. "And I need Peretti on the phone in the next 5 minutes." "Why Peretti?" Victor opened the vehicle door. "Because the federal investigation Lusk has been feeding is in the documentation phase, which means it hasn't moved yet, which means there's a window. And the only way I use that window is if I move first, and moving first in this situation is not the kind of moving I've ever done before." Roland stared at him. "What kind is it?" Victor got in the vehicle. He looked at Roland through the open door with an expression that was neither the expression of the man at the mahogany table, nor the expression of the man on the mountain slope, but something between them, something that was only beginning to have a shape. "The kind," Victor said, "where I walk into a federal building and put everything on the table before Lusk does." Roland stood in the port district with the harbor behind him and the wind off the water and the working sounds of the freight yard, and he looked at Victor with the face of a man being asked to update a fundamental assumption. "Victor," he said, everything means everything, Roland. The organization, the operations, the council, Cade and whatever he knew and didn't know, the financial structures, all of it." Victor held his eyes. "Lusk has been feeding them for 6 years. There is no version where I outrun what he's already given them. The only move I have is to be the one who opens the door instead of the one who gets the door opened on him." "That ends the family," Roland said, very quietly. Not an accusation, a statement of what was true. "The version of the family I've been running," Victor said. "Yes, it ends that." He held Roland's eyes for a moment longer, and then Roland got in the driver's seat and started the engine, and the vehicle pulled out of the logistics yard into the Port District street, and Victor called Peretti and told him exactly what he needed, and listened to the silence on the other end of the line stretch out for a long moment before Peretti said, with professional composure that was clearly working very hard, "Understood. I'll make the call." They drove north. The city thinned around them as they went. The density of buildings and the weight of the urban infrastructure easing into the corridors of highway and then into something more open. Suburbs and then the land itself, the way land reveals itself when you get far enough from the center of things. Victor watched it and thought about Hallow Ford, about the path through the hollow in the dark, about the feeling of a rope in his hands when the car above the gorge shifted and the load came through. He thought about his mother's face when she told him Caleb had come through the window and said, "We've got you." He thought about Marcus, 17 years old, 60 miles from a school with a proper engineering program, sleeping on a cot with one boot on. He thought about 12 people in a gorge, and the 6 years of documents in a federal file, and the man in a car without plates driving north on a contingency route he'd been maintaining for a moment exactly like this one. He thought about what no meant, and whether he'd meant it, and what meaning it actually required of him now that the situation had stripped away every version of forward that he'd previously held in his hands. The highway curved north. The harbor appeared briefly on the right, gray and working, and then was gone behind the land. Roland drove. And somewhere in the car without plates, 200 miles ahead of them, Raymond Lusk was doing the math on a 6-year operation that had not produced the outcome he'd planned for, and calculating what came next, not knowing that the man behind him had already decided to do the one thing that Lusk's entire architecture had been built on the assumption Victor Marcelli would never do. Peretti called back 40 minutes into the drive north. Victor had the phone to his ear before the first ring finished. Peretti was a man who organized his sentences before he spoke them, who never wasted syllables, and what he said in the next 90 seconds restructured everything. The federal task force running the Marcelli financial investigation was not, as Connolly had described it, simply in a documentation phase. Peretti's contact inside the federal building, a source so carefully maintained over so many years that Peretti referred to him only as the librarian, had pulled the thread and found that the investigation had moved into a pre-indictment review stage 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, which was 5 weeks after Lusk's shell company contracted the track inspection, which was 1 week before Lusk moved the capital through Cade's account. The timeline wasn't coincidence. Lusk had known the federal case was approaching activation and had accelerated his exit plan accordingly. The train was not the opening move. The train was the closing one. Create chaos in the Marcelli organization, provide the federal task force with the moment of instability they needed to move, and vanish before either side could identify him as the trigger. Pre-indictment review means they're writing the charges, Peretti said. Not filed, not sealed, still being written. That is the window, Victor, and it is not a wide one. How long? My best estimate from what the librarian has seen to 10 days. 2 weeks at the outside. And if I come in before charges are filed, cooperation before indictment is categorically different from cooperation after. Before, you have leverage. You are providing something they need to complete their case cleanly, to expand it, to close additional targets. You are, in the legal sense, an asset rather than a defendant. Peretti paused. After indictment, you are a defendant trying to negotiate a reduced sentence. Entirely different transaction. What do I need to give them? Everything you told me an hour ago. The organization's operational structure, the council, the financial architecture, the legitimate businesses and their relationship to the criminal base. Another pause. And Raymond Lusk. Lusk specifically. Lusk is the piece they don't have. They have the financial documentation he provided. They don't know his identity as the source. Informant agreements are sealed. If you walk in with Lusk's full history, his role, the inspection fraud, the coordinated destabilization plan, the connection to the federal informant agreement he's been running, you are giving them a case that is significantly larger than the one they've been building. That changes your position fundamentally. Victor looked through the windshield at the highway moving beneath them. And the people in my organization. That, Peretti said carefully, is the negotiation. What happens to your people is determined by what you bring, what you ask for, and how well I do my job. He stopped. I need to be direct with you. Some of the council members are not going to be protectable. The ones with direct operational exposure, the criminal base, not the legitimate side. The federal case that Lusk has been building includes documentation on their activities. I can try to manage the scope of what you provide against what they already have, but I cannot make 6 years of documents disappear. Roland, Victor said. Roland Greer's exposure is primarily protective in nature. He's your security. He's not operational in the business sense. Manageable. I believe manageable. Peretti's voice was as careful as Victor had ever heard it. Victor, I have to ask you something, and I need an honest answer because what I build depends on it. Ask. Is this decision coming from a position of strategy or a position of, he searched for the word, something else? Victor looked at the highway. He thought about the mountain and the rope and the car above the gorge. He thought about Marcus and 60 miles and no transport. He thought about June Hartley picking up the end of his mother's litter without being asked. Both, he said. I'm not going to lie to you about that, but the strategy is real. Peretti accepted this. Then I'll make the call. I have a contact at the federal prosecutor's office. He's senior enough to make commitments and careful enough to want something worth making commitments for. A final pause. Victor, once I make this call, the nature of what you are to the federal government changes within the hour. There's no, I know, Victor said. Make the call. The line went quiet. Peretti made the call. Victor put his phone on his knee and looked at the road and felt the specific physical quality of a door closing behind him. Not with violence, just the solid final sound of a door closing on the room where he'd spent 21 years, and the draft of air from the new room on the other side, which was cold and uncharted and did not yet have furniture. Victor? Roland said from the driver's seat. Yeah. Roland was quiet for a moment. The road was emptying out as they moved north, the highway shedding traffic. The coastal residence, Connolly's information, Lusk might not go there directly. If he's been maintaining the route, he has intermediate points. I know, but it's the anchor point. It's registered in his wife's name, but Lusk's wife died 4 years ago, and the property never transferred. He kept it. A man keeps a property for 4 years after the person it was for is gone. Victor looked at the side window. He keeps it because it means something. People run toward what means something, even when running toward it is a mistake. Roland nodded slowly. You think he's going there. I think a 64-year-old man who has been holding a 6-year operation together by himself, who has watched the operation fail, who has just gotten into a car in a city where everything he built is unraveling, I think he's going somewhere that feels like home. Victor looked at the road. Same reason Caleb Ward stayed on the mountain. They drove north for another hour. The land changed around them, the urban geography giving way to something older. Forest corridors and the occasional small town, the country that exists between the cities, that is neither wilderness nor suburb, but something that has been itself for longer than the surrounding development and intends to continue. Victor's phone produced a text from Peretti. 3 words. Meeting is confirmed. He texted back, time. The response? Tomorrow morning. 9 a.m., Federal Building, downtown. Come with me, not your men. He put the phone away. Tomorrow morning. Which meant tonight was the only night available for what had to happen first. What had to happen before he sat across a federal prosecutor's table and began the process of dismantling everything he'd built. He needed to look at Raymond Lusk. Not for information, Peretti had enough. Not for revenge, because the version of him that would have answered that instinct was the version that was closing in the room behind him. He needed to look at the man who had been sitting across tables from him for 19 years and had been carrying this, and he needed to understand it, because the thing he didn't understand about it was the thing that would haunt him if he didn't resolve it before he walked into the federal building. He needed to know why. The coastal community was a cluster of old houses on a headland above the water, the kind of place that had been a fishing community and had partially gentrified and partially resisted gentrification and had settled into a complicated coexistence of both. The Lusk property was at the north end, not the largest house, not the most visible, but a white frame house set back from the headland road with a view of the water and the kind of surrounding vegetation that had been growing undirected for years. There was a light on inside. Roland pulled the vehicle off the headland road and into the vegetation 40 yards back from the property line and killed the engine. They sat for a moment and looked at the house. 1 car in the drive, Roland said. Dark sedan, different plates from what the port team described, but it's been 3 hours. Geller's with him, or he dropped him and left. Unknown. Roland looked at the house with the professional assessment he brought to these situations. You want to wait for... No, Victor said. He was already opening the door. Victor, you're walking up to the house of a man who arranged to kill your mother, with no weapon, no backup. He's 64 years old, and he's been sitting in that house for the last hour knowing that the thing he planned for 20 years is over, Victor said. I'm not here to hurt him. He knows that. How does he know that? Because if I wanted to hurt him, I wouldn't come myself. He looked at Roland across the vehicle roof. Stay here. If I'm not out in 30 minutes, call Peretti. He walked across the wet grass toward the house in the dark. The headland wind was off the water, cold and salt-carrying, and it moved through his jacket in a way that was unpleasant and irrelevant. The house had a front porch, and the porch light was off, but the window to the left of the door, what would be a sitting room, was lit from inside, and through the glass Victor could see the silhouette of a man sitting in a chair. He walked up the porch steps and knocked on the door. Silence inside. The particular silence of someone deciding. Then footsteps. The door opened. Raymond Lusk was, in the physics of the moment, smaller than Victor remembered. Not in stature. He was a tall man, always had been, with the contained physical presence of someone who had taken care of himself over the years. But something had gone out of the containment. The man in the doorway had the look of someone from whom a sustaining pressure had been removed, and without the pressure, the structure had lost some of its uprightness. He looked at Victor for a long moment. Come in, he said. The sitting room was the room Victor had seen through the window. It had the particular quality of a house that had been someone's before it became a contingency. Furniture chosen by another person, photographs on the walls that were years old, the accumulated presence of a life that had been lived here and had stopped. A woman's house, Victor understood. Lusk's wife's house, maintained for 4 years as, what? A memorial, a retreat, a door out. Lusk sat back down in the chair he'd been in. Victor sat across from him on a couch that had been expensive once and had been sat on enough to become comfortable. Between them, on the coffee table, was a glass of something amber. 1 glass. Lusk hadn't been expecting company or had made peace with drinking alone. Victor looked at him. Lusk looked back. The face of a man who has been running a complex operation for a long time and has arrived at the end of it and is still processing the texture of the ending. "Your mother is alive," Lusk said. "Yes." "I know." He said it without apparent emotion, which was either genuine or the exhaustion of someone who has spent all available emotional resource on the last 24 hours. "I've been monitoring. I saw the survivor count." He looked at his glass without picking it up. "I want to be clear about something." "Go ahead." The track failure was designed to disable the train, to create a situation, extended rescue, isolation, disruption. It was not designed to— He stopped. The structural modeling indicated the rear cars would stay on the grade. The gorge section was the front of the train. She was in the rear. Victor held the man's eyes. 12 people died in the gorge, Raymond. Lusk absorbed this. He absorbed it visibly, which was, in its way, more information than any sentence he could have spoken. He picked up the glass and held it without drinking. "I know," he said. "Tell me why," Victor said. Lusk looked at him. "Why?" 19 years. You came into my father's organization. You worked with me through the transition. You helped build the legitimate side. The entire portfolio, the investment structure, everything we were building toward a different version of what this family is." Victor's voice was level. 6 years ago, you started handing it to the federal task force. Why? Lusk set the glass down. He looked at the photographs on the wall, his wife's photographs, people from another time. "Do you remember a man named Daniel Cross?" Victor thought. "Vaguely. Port worker, 12, 13 years ago. He was a longshoreman, 41 years old, wife, 3 children. He got in the way of a product shipment moving through the port. Wrong place, seen something he shouldn't have. Your father made a decision." Lusk looked at the photographs. "I was in the room when your father made the decision. I was 30 seconds from that room when the decision was carried out." Victor sat with this. He'd known the shape of his father's operating methods. He'd known them as the environment he grew up in, and then inherited, and then spent years trying to systematically replace with something that could exist in daylight. "Daniel Cross," Lusk said, "had a son, 17 at the time. The son grew up, became a federal investigator, criminal division." He finally looked at Victor. "He came to me 6 years ago. He had enough to build a case on me personally. Historic financial involvement, the organizational connections. He gave me a choice. Cooperation or prosecution? Yes." Lusk was quiet for a moment. "I chose cooperation. Not entirely from self-preservation. Partly, but partly because of Daniel Cross's face, which I have been looking at from the inside of my memory for 13 years. He looked at his hands. "I told myself I was providing information on a criminal organization. I told myself the legitimate business structures were the laundering mechanism, and exposing them was the right thing. I told myself I was not betraying you personally, I was exposing the institution." "And the train?" "The train was when the task force told me the case was moving to indictment. They told me 6 weeks ago. I had to choose between being named in the prosecution or—" He stopped. "Or accelerating, creating the conditions for the organization's collapse before the indictment, stepping back before the indictment became public, disappearing into the cooperation agreement's protections." He looked at Victor with something that was the closest thing to raw that Victor had seen on his face. "I told myself the rear cars would hold. I told myself nobody in the rear section would be seriously hurt. I ran the modeling 4 times. "Your modeling was wrong," Victor said. "Yes. 12 people. I know." The room was quiet. Outside, the headland wind moved through the surrounding vegetation. Victor looked at the man across from him. 64 years old, a man who had spent 6 years living in 2 directions simultaneously, who had apparently done it not purely from cowardice or treachery, but from the accumulated weight of a 13-year guilt that had never found a resolution and had eventually found the wrong one. It didn't make the 12 people less dead. It didn't make it manageable or forgivable or anything useful, but it made it human in the specific, ugly way that human things are. Complicated at the root, not clean, not the simple architecture of villain and victim that made the story easier to carry. Victor stood up. The federal task force, he said. Your cooperation agreement. The informant handler. I need a name. Lusk looked at him. Why? Because I'm meeting with the federal prosecutor's office tomorrow morning at 9. He let that sit for a moment, watched it land on Lusk's face. I need to know who I'm walking into. Lusk stared at him. The calculation behind his eyes ran fast and visible. You're cooperating. Yes. Victor. He sat forward. What I've given them, the documentation on the financial structures, the business portfolio. If you walk in there with cooperation terms, they will use what I gave them against. I know, Victor said. I know exactly what they have and what they'll use it for. Peretti has been on the phone for the last 3 hours. I know the scope of what you provided. He looked at Lusk steadily. And I'm walking in anyway, because the alternative is being indicted on documentation I can't outrun, and because... He stopped, started again, more honestly. And because it's the right thing to do. The last sentence surprised him slightly, coming out with that particular weight. Not performance, just accurate. Lusk sat back in his chair and looked at Victor with an expression Victor couldn't quite read. Something between disbelief and recognition. The face of someone encountering an unexpected echo of their own decision-making in someone else's. His name is Drummond, Lusk said. Senior Agent, Organized Crime Task Force. He's the one who approached me 6 years ago. He's who you'll be dealing with. Victor filed the name. I need one more thing from you. What? The modeling, the track failure engineering, the inspection report modification, the specific mechanism. All of it, documented, with your signature on it. He looked at the man across from him. I'm walking into that federal building with Lusk as a complete file, not just a name. You give me the documentation, and you call Drummond tonight and you tell him you're coming in. No more running. What happens after that is between you and whoever is responsible for what happened on that mountain. Lusk looked at the floor, a long look, the kind that is happening entirely on the inside. And if I don't, he said, then I take the information I have and I walk into the federal building without you. And the story I tell Drummond about Raymond Lusk is the story I've assembled from what I know, which is accurate but is not as complete or as favorable as the story you could tell yourself. Victor held his eyes. 12 people, Raymond. However you're modeling, read the situation. 12 people. The silence lasted 15 seconds. Lusk got up from the chair and went to a desk in the corner of the room and opened the bottom drawer and removed a brown envelope that had the thickness of something prepared in advance, something that had been ready to go, the documentation package a man builds when he knows an operation is ending and wants to control the terms of the ending. He held it out to Victor. Victor took it. I'll call Drummond tonight, Lusk said. His voice had gone to something very quiet, past the quality of composure and past the quality of defeat, into something that was just the sound of a man who has come to the end of a very long and very costly piece of work. Victor put the envelope in his jacket. He looked around the room one more time. His wife's room, 4 years of maintained absence, and he went to the door. Victor, Lusk said behind him. He stopped but didn't turn. The boy on the mountain, Lusk said. The young one. I saw the rescue coverage on the news. The kid who was on the anchor line when car 4 shifted. A pause. What happens to those people now? Victor stood at the door for a moment. That's the other conversation I'm going to have, he said. After tomorrow. He went out through the door and across the porch and into the headland dark, and the wind off the water hit him full in the face, and he stood in it for a moment and breathed it. Then he walked back across the grass to the vehicle where Roland was waiting. Roland looked at the envelope in his jacket, didn't ask what it was, started the engine. They drove south. Victor called Peretti from the road and reported what he had, and Peretti's controlled breathing on the other end of the line was the closest the man ever came to audible relief. He gave Peretti Drummond's name and heard the brief silence that meant Peretti was filing the information and building with it. This is a strong position, Peretti said. Walking in with the informant's documentation and the informant's voluntary capitulation, that changes the prosecutor's calculus significantly. How significantly? Significantly enough that your personal criminal exposure may be manageable to a degree I could not have projected 2 hours ago. He paused. I want to be honest with you. I don't know the full shape of tomorrow yet. There are variables, but this is a different situation than the one we were discussing in the Port District. Victor looked at the road moving south. The legitimate businesses, the investment portfolio, what Lusk gave them on the financial structures. Yes, I'm not fighting to protect those structures. I want that clear in how you approach the negotiation. Peretti was quiet for a moment. Victor, those assets represent. I know what they represent. I'm telling you not to fight to protect them. He watched the highway. There are other things I want protection for. The people who aren't operationally exposed, Roland, specific staff, and the resources. Not the criminal proceeds. I understand those are forfeit, but the legitimate investment returns. A portion. I need a portion protected for a specific use. What use? He thought about Marcus asleep with one boot on and 60 miles without transport, and a community hall in the hollow with an industrial coffee urn and the particular warmth of people who move toward problems without being asked. I'll tell you tomorrow, Victor said. Put it in the terms. Humanitarian foundation, community development focus, the specific location to be determined post-negotiation. Peretti, make it a condition, not a request. A condition. Another pause. When Peretti spoke again, his voice had something in it that was not purely professional. Understood, he said. I'll make it a condition. The city came back into view around midnight, the way cities do. The light before the buildings, the glow of it against the low clouds. Victor watched it assemble itself on the horizon and thought about the first time he'd driven this approach, 21 years ago, coming back from his first real operation for the family, 18 hours out, and returning to the city that was his and that he was going to make completely his, with the specific certainty of someone who is 22 and has mistaken force of will for understanding. He'd been wrong about a great deal, not about the force of will. That part had been accurate, but about what it was for. He called his mother at 12:30 a.m. She picked up on the second ring, which told him she hadn't been sleeping, which told him she'd been doing what she always did when she was waiting on something, sitting with it, fully awake, refusing to pretend. You're in the car, she said. Coming back south. Did you find him? Yes. Silence for a moment. And? He's calling in. Tomorrow he'll be in federal custody. He listened to her breathe for a moment on the other end. Mom, I need to tell you something. Tell me. Tomorrow morning, I'm going into the federal building with Peretti. I'm cooperating with the Organized Crime Task Force investigation. He said it the way he'd said things to her his whole life, straight, without management, knowing she would read through any softening anyway. The organization as it's been, the council, the operations, the structure, it's over. What happens to the people in it depends on the negotiation, and Peretti is good, but some of them are going to face significant consequences, and I can't prevent that. The silence was longer this time. Victor, she said. I know. I'm not. She stopped herself, started again, with the care of someone choosing words for their accuracy. I'm not going to tell you I'm surprised. I've been watching you build towards something for years. I didn't know it would look like this, but I'm not surprised. I'm going to lose most of what I've built, he said. The legitimate structures, the portfolio, it becomes part of the federal case. What's protected after the negotiation is a fraction. What fraction? Enough, he said, for what I want to do with it. She was quiet for a moment. He could picture her in the townhouse, in the room she'd lived in for 40 years, sitting up with her wrist wrapped and the lamp on, and the expression she had when she was finished processing and had arrived at acceptance. Not passive acceptance, but the active kind, the kind that is ready to engage with what comes next. The hollow, she said. Yes. Caleb Ward. Yes. And Marcus, and June Hartley, and everyone else in Hallowford and Greer's Hollow, and every community like it that I drove past for 20 years without seeing. He looked at the city lights coming closer. It won't be enough to fix everything. It's not going to be. I know what the scale of need looks like and what the scale of available resource looks like, and they don't match. But it's a start. It's more than a start, she said quietly. Victor, it's She stopped. He heard her breathe in and knew from the slight catch in it that the rib was still giving her trouble. It's the thing I didn't know how to ask you for. He held the phone against his ear, and the city moved toward him, and he didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that would be more than what she'd just said. Get some sleep, she said. You have a meeting tomorrow. I know. And Victor, a pause. Call Caleb Ward tonight, before you sleep, whatever hour it is. Why tonight? Because a man who walked up a mountain in the dark to help strangers deserves to know that the stranger is going to try to do right by him, she said. Don't make him wait until the legal arrangements are settled. Call him tonight. Victor looked at the city. He was almost back inside it now, the skyline visible through the windshield, the lights of it doing what city lights do at midnight, offering the illusion of warmth at a distance. He'd built a life in that city. He'd built a name in it, an architecture of power and influence and control, an empire in the specific language his world used for such things. Tomorrow morning, he was going to begin the process of dismantling it in a room with federal prosecutors and his attorney. And when he came out of that room, he was going to be something he'd never been in his adult life, which was a man without the protection of what he'd built. He thought about what it felt like to hold an anchor line when the load came through. I'll call him, he said. He ended the call. He looked for Caleb Ward's number in his phone. He'd taken it at the community hall that morning that already felt like a month ago. And he found it, and he held it for a moment, and then he pressed call. The phone rang 4 times, and he expected voicemail, and then the line connected, and Caleb's voice came through, not groggy, the voice of someone who was awake at this hour, because some people are awake at this hour, because some kinds of work don't keep regular schedules. Marcelli, Caleb said. He'd registered the number. I told you I wanted to have a conversation, Victor said. When things were clearer. I'm not there yet. Tomorrow is going to be complicated, and what comes out of tomorrow is going to take time to settle. But I wanted to call tonight, before tomorrow. A brief silence on Caleb's end, not uncomfortable. The silence of someone listening with their full attention. All right, Caleb said. I'm listening. Victor took a breath. I'm going to need to build something, he said. Something different from what I've been building. I don't have the full shape of it yet. I'll know more after tomorrow. But the center of it, the thing it's going to be organized around. He looked at the city coming toward him through the windshield. That's your community, Caleb. And communities like it. If you're willing to be part of designing what that looks like. The silence this time was longer. You know I'm going to want to see how tomorrow goes before I take anything you're saying at face value, Caleb said. I know. And the meeting after that. And the one after that. I know. Marcus, Caleb said. Not a question, not quite. Marcus specifically, Victor said. Engineering school, proper program, full support, no 60-mile problem. Caleb, that's not contingent on anything. That's the thing I can make happen now, and I'm going to make it happen regardless of how the rest of this goes. A longer silence. Call me after tomorrow, Caleb said. Tell me what it looks like. I will. The line went quiet. Victor put his phone away. Roland turned the vehicle off the highway and into the city streets, and they drove toward the residence through midnight streets, and Victor sat with the particular quality of stillness that comes after a long period of motion, after hours of being in the vehicle moving north and south, after the mountain and the gorge, and Lusk's white frame house and the headland wind, after the phone calls and the decisions, and the no that he'd meant and was finding out what it actually meant. And the city around him did what cities do, which was to continue being itself with or without his participation. Indifferent and enormous, and full of people who were doing whatever people do at midnight, sleeping, working, sitting alone with the lights on, moving through the dark streets in vehicles with the city glow washing over them. He was going into a federal building in 9 hours. He was going to sit across a table from prosecutors and give them what they wanted and negotiate for what he needed and start the process of becoming something he couldn't fully picture yet. Not because the picture wasn't coming, but because you don't see the room clearly until you're inside it, and he wasn't inside it yet. Roland pulled to a stop in front of the residence. Victor sat in the vehicle for a moment after the engine cut off. Roland didn't move. He understood that Victor needed a moment, which was the kind of understanding that came from 11 years of proximity, and that Victor would, in the accounting ahead, need to find a way to properly acknowledge. "Roland," Victor said. "Yeah. What I said in the Port District, about what tomorrow means for the organization." "Yeah. For you specifically, Peretti believes your exposure is manageable. He's going to work it." Roland was quiet for a moment. "I'm not worried about my exposure." "I know you're not. I'm telling you anyway." Victor looked at the townhouse facade. "You've been doing this for 11 years without asking for anything except to be trusted with the work. I want you to know that the accounting of that, what it's worth, that's not something I'm going to let get lost in whatever happens in the next few months." Roland looked at him, the face of a man receiving something he wasn't expecting and wasn't sure how to hold. "All right," Roland said. Victor got out of the vehicle. He went up the townhouse steps and through the door and stood for a moment in the entrance hall, in the house his grandfather had bought with money that had not been clean, that his father had filled with things purchased with money that had been cleaner but not clean, that Victor had maintained and secured and made the center of an empire that was ending tonight in a white frame house on a headland 200 miles north. The house was quiet. His mother's light was off. He went upstairs. He sat on the edge of his bed without removing his jacket for a long moment, looking at the floor. Then he opened the jacket and removed the brown envelope Lusk had given him. The documentation package, the engineering modeling, the inspection report modification, the complete file of what had happened to the Ardmore Continental above the Arden Creek Gorge. He held it. He thought about the 12 people. He didn't rush past it. He sat with it in the specific, costly way that honest sitting with things requires, without deflection, without the management of it into something more bearable, without the framework of justification that he could have constructed if he'd wanted one. 12 people. He would carry that. He couldn't carry it to the federal table tomorrow. It was Lusk's to carry there, and whatever justice looked like in that specific context was not Victor's to determine. But he would carry it himself in his own accounting for as long as the accounting ran, which he understood in this moment was going to be the rest of his life. He set the envelope on the nightstand. He removed his jacket and lay down on the bed without pulling the covers, and looked at the ceiling of the room where he'd slept since taking over this house, and he breathed and let the events of the last 36 hours settle into whatever shape they were going to take. The mountain, and the rope, and the rain, and his mother's face, and Caleb moving in the dark, and Lusk in his dead wife's chair, and the highway at midnight, and the federal building 9 hours away. The ceiling didn't tell him anything. He closed his eyes. And in the specific silence of a decision fully made, with the city doing its work outside and his mother breathing somewhere down the hall, and Roland in a vehicle outside that hadn't yet moved because Roland was Roland, Victor Marcelli slept for 4 hours, which was enough, which was what there was. And when the alarm brought him back at 6 a.m., the first thing he thought about was not the federal building. The first thing he thought about was Marcus, and 60 miles, and the particular steadiness of a 17-year-old boy who read load dynamics before the calculation was articulated and held an anchor line in the dark and the rain, and did not once, in all the hours Victor watched him, look at the problem as though it were larger than what he was capable of meeting. Victor got up. He showered and dressed in the dark and went downstairs and stood in the kitchen and made coffee the way his mother had taught him. Specific quantities, specific temperature, no shortcuts, because some things are worth doing with the full attention they require. And coffee at 6 a.m. before the most consequential day of your adult life is one of those things. He drank it standing at the kitchen counter in the house his grandfather built, in the city he'd run for 21 years on the morning he was going to walk into a federal building and put it all on the table. And outside the kitchen window, the city was doing what cities do at 6 a.m., which is beginning again, the way cities always begin again, indifferent to the weight of individual reckonings, but capacious enough to hold them all. All the people in all the kitchens on all the mornings when everything changes, and the coffee is just coffee, and the window just shows you the street, and the street just shows you the city, and the city just keeps going, which is, in its way, the most honest thing about it. His phone showed a text from Peretti sent at 5:47 a.m. "Ready when you are." Victor finished his coffee. He put on his jacket. He picked up the brown envelope from the nightstand, and he went to his mother's door, and he knocked. And when she said, "Come in," he opened the door and stood in the doorway and looked at her, sitting up in bed in the early light, her wrist wrapped, her expression already fully present the way she was always fully present. And he said, "I'm going now," and she said, "I know." And he said, "I'll call when it's done." And she said, "I'll be here." And he stood in the doorway for a moment longer than he needed to, because some moments you recognize as the last of something while you're still in them, and the recognition requires a second, just a second, before you move. He moved. The federal building at 9 a.m. was ordinary in the way that consequential places often are. No drama in the lobby, fluorescent light on gray tile, a security desk with 2 guards who processed Victor and Peretti with the professional indifference of people who have processed many people through many metal detectors on many mornings. The elevator was slow. The hallway on the 7th floor smelled of industrial cleaning fluid and old carpet and the particular staleness of a building that is climate-controlled year-round and never opens a window. Peretti walked beside him without speaking. He'd said everything necessary over the phone, and in the hour they'd spent at the residence going over terms at 7 a.m., he was carrying a briefcase that contained everything that needed to be carried. And his face was the face of a man who has prepared as thoroughly as preparation allows and has made his peace with the variables that remain. The room they were shown into had a table, 8 chairs, a window overlooking the street below, and a credenza with a coffee service that no one touched. 3 people were already seated. A woman in her 40s who introduced herself as Assistant U.S. Attorney. Diane Reyes. She said it with the economy of someone who doesn't use titles for effect, but carries the weight of them quietly. A man named Park, who was federal financial crimes, with a tablet and the expression of someone for whom numbers are the primary language of human behavior. And Senior Agent Drummond, who was 63 years old and had the specific build of someone who had been doing this particular kind of work for long enough that the work had become physical, had settled into his posture and his eyes, and the way he sat in a chair in a room like this one. Drummond looked at Victor when he came through the door, and the look was not the look of someone meeting a subject. It was the look of someone who had been reading a file for 6 years and was now encountering the file's subject in 3 dimensions, and finding that the 3-dimensional version was not what the file had prepared him for. Victor sat down across from them. Peretti sat beside him. The envelope was on the table. Reyes said, "Mr. Marcelli, thank you for coming in." Victor looked at her steadily. "Let's not do that," he said. "Not hostility, just preference for the register the situation actually warranted." She looked at him for a moment, and then something in her expression shifted. A small professional adjustment, a recalibration toward directness that she apparently found more comfortable anyway. "All right," she said, "then let's get into it." They got into it. What followed was 4 hours that Victor would later think of not as a single block of time, but as a sequence of rooms, each one entered and then left behind. The first room was the structure of the Marcelli organization. Its criminal operations, its counsel, its lines of authority and decision-making, laid out in the clinical language that Peretti had helped Victor prepare and that Victor delivered without hesitation and without the performance of reluctance, because he had already made the decision, and performing reluctance at the execution was the kind of dishonesty that served no one. Drummond asked questions. Park asked questions about the financial architecture. Victor answered. The second room was Thomas Cade. Victor told them what he knew, what he'd verified through Peretti's investigator, and what remained uncertain. He told them Cade's specific position, the 14% stake, the capital transfer, the question of knowing versus not knowing, and he told them he couldn't resolve that question for them, that it required their own investigation of the communication record, and that he would not characterize Cade's culpability beyond what he could actually substantiate. Reyes watched him do this with an attention that wasn't entirely prosecutorial. She was reading something about him, the same way Caleb had read him on the mountain. She was deciding something. The third room was Raymond Lusk. Victor put the envelope on the table, and Drummond looked at it, and then looked at Victor, and in that look was the acknowledgement that what was in the envelope was going to change the shape of the case in ways that Drummond was already calculating. "He called you last night," Victor said. "He's coming in voluntarily. What's in the envelope is his documentation. The inspection engineering, the modification to the report, the capital routing. His signature is on all of it." Drummond opened the envelope. He looked at the documents with a methodical speed that spoke of experience. His face did not change, but his breathing did, very slightly, the kind of change a person makes when they encounter something that satisfies a long search. The 12 fatalities, Reyes said. She wasn't asking a question. She was naming what was in the room. The track failure was Lusk's design, Victor said. The intent, as he explained it to me, was disruption rather than death. The structural modeling was wrong. The outcome was not the designed outcome. He held her eyes. That's his account. It doesn't change the outcome. No, Reyes said. It doesn't. The fourth room was the negotiation, and this was where Peretti did most of the talking, and where Victor sat and looked at the window and the street below and let the process move at its own speed, because Peretti was good, and the terms were defensible, and the position they'd walked in with was the strongest position available given the circumstances. What emerged over the next 90 minutes was an agreement that was not mercy. Mercy was not what federal prosecutors dispensed, but was the recognition of value exchanged. Victor's cooperation would expand the case significantly, provide documentation that Lusk's informant contributions had deliberately omitted, and allow the prosecution to close threads that had been open for years. In return, his personal criminal exposure was structured to a specific set of charges that carried, with cooperation credit, a sentencing range that Peretti had described in the car as survivable. Not good. Survivable. The legitimate business assets, the investment portfolio, the properties, the financial structures that Lusk had spent 6 years documenting for the task force, the majority were subject to forfeiture. Peretti argued for a carve-out, one specific instrument, and Reyes pushed back, and they went 3 rounds on it before Drummond said something quiet to Reyes that Victor couldn't hear, and Reyes looked at the carve-out proposal again and said carefully that the foundation structure could be considered contingent on ongoing cooperation. It's a condition, Peretti said. Not contingent. Reyes looked at Victor. What's it for? Victor told her. Not as a pitch, as information, the same way he'd been delivering information all morning. The community in the hollow, the road, the school, Marcus and the engineering program in 60 miles of distance, the rescue operation that had done in 6 hours what the official emergency response couldn't do in 12. Reyes looked at him for a long moment after he finished. Something moved through her face that was not part of the professional register she'd been operating in all morning. She picked up her pen and wrote something on the document in front of her. Condition, she said. They signed what needed signing, shook hands that needed shaking. Drummond walked them to the elevator and in the hallway while Peretti took a call, stood next to Victor for a moment in the fluorescent light. Lusk came in at 8 this morning, Drummond said. Before you. I know, Victor said. He texted me. Drummond looked at him with something that was the product of 30 years in a specific kind of work. You went to him last night, got the documentation, sent him in. Yes. Why didn't you just turn over what you had and let us find him? Victor looked at the elevator door. Because I needed to understand something. About why. Did you? Mostly. He looked at Drummond. Daniel Cross. Longshoreman, 41 years old. 12 years ago. You have a file on him. Drummond's expression shifted. Not dramatically, but the way a landscape shifts when the angle of light changes. Recognition, and something more personal than recognition. I know the name, Drummond said carefully. His son came after Raymond Lusk 6 years ago. That's how this started. Victor held the man's eyes. However the case goes, whatever happens in the prosecution, I want that family to know that what their father's son set in motion had an outcome. Not the outcome he designed, but an outcome. He held Drummond's eyes. Can you make sure they know? Drummond was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Yeah, I can do that. The elevator came. Victor got in. The doors closed and the elevator descended and the lobby appeared and he walked through it and out through the glass doors into the city morning, the October light on the street, the ordinary noise of the city at work. Peretti came out beside him. That went as well as it could have gone, he said. I know. The next 18 months are not going to be simple. I know. But you're on the other side of the worst of it. Peretti looked at him. For what it's worth, and I've been doing this a long time, so I think it's worth something. What you did in that room this morning is not something most people in your position would do. Victor looked at the street, at the people moving on it, going to their mornings, carrying their own weight, doing what people do. It's what needed doing, he said. Peretti nodded. He went to his car. Victor stood on the sidewalk outside the federal building and called his mother. She picked up on the first ring. "It's done," he said. She didn't speak for a moment. He heard her breathe, the careful breath of someone managing the rib that was still healing, the breath that had become a kind of clock for him over the past days, measuring her recovery. "Come home," she said. He went home. The months that followed were not simple, as Peretti had said, and Peretti had meant it the way a man means something when he has specific knowledge of what not simple entails. There were depositions, there were hearings, there were the council members who had known and those who had not, and separating the two required work that was methodical and costly, and sometimes required Victor to say things in rooms that he would carry afterward. Thomas Cade's investigation resolved into a conclusion that matched what Victor had told Reyes. The moving of money without the full knowledge of its purpose, a willful blindness that was its own form of culpability but was distinct from design. Cade's legal situation was serious. It was not Lusk's. Raymond Lusk's prosecution moved with the particular deliberate speed of cases that have too much documentation to rush through. The 12 fatalities were central to it. The engineering analysis of the track failure and the inspection report modification were entered into the record, and the case that Drummond's task force built around them was thorough in the way that cases built over time on solid material are thorough. Lusk pled. The sentencing was what it was. Victor read the outcome in 3 sentences on his phone on a Tuesday morning and put the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment and then made coffee, because that was what there was to do. The organization dismantled not dramatically, but in the incremental, unglamorous way of things that are taken apart deliberately, rather than destroyed. The council members whose exposure was direct were processed through the legal system with the cooperation of documentation Victor had provided. Roland's exposure resolved as Peretti had projected. Manageable, managed. The men who had worked for the family for years scattered into the ordinary world in the ways people scatter when the structure that organized them stops existing, and some of them found their way to legitimate work and some of them didn't, and Victor couldn't control which was which, only the portion that he could directly provide for, which he did. Sal Ferretti retired, formally, to a house in the coastal communities north of the city and called Victor once a month with the specific regularity of someone maintaining an important habit. The calls were brief. They were, in their brevity, more honest than most long conversations Victor had had in his life. The foundation took shape over the first 6 months. Peretti's carve-out had protected a specific financial instrument, not large by the standards of what Victor had once controlled, but adequate, functioning, enough to build from rather than simply gesture with. Victor hired a director named Kwame Asante, who had spent 12 years running community development initiatives and who interviewed Victor with a directness that reminded him, not unpleasantly, of Caleb Ward and June Hartley, and the particular quality of people who cannot be performed at, only met. Kwame's first question: what do you actually know about the communities you're trying to help? Victor's answer: not enough. That's why you're here. Kwame's second question: are you trying to do good or trying to feel better? The pause before Victor answered was genuine, not tactical. Both, probably. I think you have to be honest about that. Kwame looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Okay, when do we start?" The road to Hallow Ford was the first project, not because it was the most strategically significant. Kwame had mapped community infrastructure needs across a 30-county region and could identify higher-impact investments by the numbers. But Victor told him early that there were situations where the numbers were not the only argument, and the road to Hallow Ford was one of them. The county was persuaded, with the combination of the foundation's resources and the kind of pressure that can be applied through legal channels, when legal channels are the only channels available to you, which Victor was still learning to navigate with something approaching patience. The road work began in month 4. It was not a large project in the engineering sense, upgrading an existing fire track, extending the grade, making it passable year-round by vehicles that weren't specifically equipped for the terrain. But in the engineering sense of what it meant to 63 people who had been on the wrong side of a deferred list since 2009, it was the difference between connected and isolated, between visible and forgotten. Caleb Ward was on the site every day of the construction. Not directing it, the county road crew was doing the work, but present. Walking the grade, checking the drainage specifications, looking at the material choices with the eyes of someone who would be living with the outcome after the crew left. He and the foreman had 3 significant disagreements over the course of the project and resolved each one by looking at the ground together and letting the ground tell them what it needed. Victor drove up twice during the construction. The first time he stood at the edge of the work site and watched and didn't say much, and Caleb came and stood beside him in the way of someone who has made his assessment and is operating from it. "You are still here," Caleb said. "Yes." Caleb nodded once. They watched the machinery work for a while. "Marcus starts in January," Caleb said. "The civil engineering program at Hartwell University." "I know. Kwame's team coordinated the enrollment. He asked me last week if he should feel—" Caleb paused, finding the word. "He asked me if it was okay to take it. The support." He looked at the road. "He's been thinking about what it means, where it comes from." "What did you tell him?" "I told him to think about what he's going to build with it," Caleb said. "What he does with it is what it is, not where it started." Victor looked at the grade curving through the mountain timber. "Is that what you told yourself? About accepting any of this?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I told myself that the community didn't have the luxury of deciding what help was philosophically acceptable based on its origin." He glanced at Victor. "And I told myself that I'd been watching you for 8 months by that point, and you'd shown up to the work every time. That counts for something." "8 months isn't—" "No," Caleb said. "It's not, but it's what we have." He turned back to the site. "You keep showing up, it becomes something more." The second visit was in month 10, when the road was finished and the school question had been resolved. Not reopened, the population wasn't there for a full school, but a learning center, jointly funded by the foundation and a state education initiative that Kwame had spent 6 weeks convincing the right people to move on. The learning center was in the old community hall, refurbished, the same building where the rescued passengers had been brought the night of the crash, where Helen Pruitt had worked through the dark with her modest kit and full competence, where the industrial coffee urn had produced coffee for everyone who needed it without regard for who they were. Helen was teaching a health fundamentals class there twice a week. She had a proper kit now. Victor walked through the building on his second visit and stood for a moment in the center of the main room, which smelled of new wood and the particular clean smell of a space that has been restored to usefulness. The floor had been refinished, the old grain showing through the new finish, preserved rather than covered. He stood on it and looked at the walls, which had been freshly painted but kept their original dimensions, their original proportions, the structure of a building that had been built to last by people who expected to need it for a long time. June Hartley found him there. She had that particular quality of arriving in a space and being fully in it immediately, the quality he'd first noticed in the dark on the mountain path. "It's good," she said, looking at the room. "Yes. You going to keep coming up here? If that's all right." She considered this with the same brevity she applied to most things. "That's Caleb's call mostly, but I'll say this. You're less of a city thing than you were." She looked at him with the frankness that was simply her register. "That mountain did something to you." "Yes," he said. "Most people," she said, "the mountain just scares them, and then they go home and the scared wears off." She looked at the floor. "You didn't go home the same." He didn't have an answer for that wasn't smaller than the statement, so he didn't offer one. In the 12th month, on an October morning that matched, in its temperature and its particular gray light, the morning of the crash a year before, Victor drove to the Kelso Pass. Alone. No Roland, no Peretti, no Kwame, no agenda. He drove the pass road, which had been repaired and reopened by the county 4 months after the crash. And he parked at the overlook where the path to the gorge began, and he got out of the car and stood at the edge of the overlook and looked down. The gorge was quiet. The creek was lower than it had been that night. October was drier than it had been then, the storm season not yet arrived. The wreckage was gone, recovered in the months following, the site cleared by the railroad company's salvage team and then assessed and documented and closed. What remained was the gorge itself, the creek, the rock walls, the timber on the upper slopes, the mountain doing what it had been doing for 10,000 years, indifferent and immense and present. He stood at the overlook for a long time. He thought about 12 people, because that was what this place required of him, and he did it without management. Their names were in the public record of the investigation. He knew them, not personally, but as names he had read enough times that they had specific weight now, the weight of specific people who had been on a train on a specific night and had ended up in the gorge below him. He stood with that weight and let it be what it was, which was not something that got lighter with time, but something that you learned to carry differently, distributed more evenly across the whole structure of you. He heard footsteps on the overlook path. He turned. Caleb came up through the timber in his work jacket, moving at the pace of someone who knows the path and isn't in a hurry. He reached the overlook and stood beside Victor and looked down at the gorge without comment. They stood together like that for a while, the two of them, and the mountain, and the quiet. "You knew I was coming," Victor said. "I saw your car at the trailhead." Caleb looked at the creek below. "I come up here sometimes, since it happened." "Why?" "Same reason as you, probably." They stood in the October light and the quiet that is the specific quiet of high places in still weather. The kind that is not silence, but is instead the sound of everything that doesn't make noise. "Marcus called me last week," Victor said, "from school." "Yeah, he told me. He's good. Kwame says his professors are that he's ahead of where they expected." Caleb almost smiled. The corner of his mouth, the brief involuntary tightening. "I know. He calls me twice a week, Tuesday nights and Sunday mornings. Tells me what he's working on." He looked at the gorge. "Last week it was load distribution and suspension bridge design. He explained it to me for 20 minutes. Did you follow it?" "Most of it." Now the smile came fully, briefly. "I built things before he was born. Some of the underlying logic isn't new to me." He looked at Victor. "He's going to build something real. That kid is going to put his name on something that will stand for 50 years after he's gone." Victor held that. The specific quality of it, the future opening forward from this place, from the mountain that had nearly taken his mother and had taken 12 others, and had turned out to be the location where something else started, some different direction, some road that hadn't existed before that night, and that he was still learning to travel. "What happens with you now?" Caleb said. "The legal situation." "Sentencing is in 2 months. Peretti thinks the cooperation credit is going to produce the low end of the range. The specific charges are structured narrowly. I'll do time." He said it the way you say true things about yourself when you're done managing them. Just the information. "Not long, but some. And after. The foundation continues. Kwame will run it. I'll be involved from whatever distance the terms allow." He looked at the gorge. "There are 43 communities on the regional map that Kwame has identified with comparable need to Hallow Ford. The road, the school question, the medical access problem. Those aren't unique to this mountain. They're a pattern. We're 4 months into the second project." He stopped. "It's slow. It's the slowest thing I've ever done." "Yes," Caleb said. "You don't seem surprised." "Good work is slow," Caleb said. "Fast work looks impressive, and then it falls." He said it simply, the way he said everything, without the desire to make it more than what it was. "The road we built is going to hold because we took the time to get the drainage right. Could have done it faster. The road would have washed in 2 winters." Victor stood with that. The lesson was not subtle, and Caleb was not a subtle man, and neither of them needed to dress it up. "I want to tell you something," Victor said, "that I haven't found the right way to say in the past year." Caleb waited. He was good at waiting. "What you did that night, what all of you did, the way you moved toward it." Victor stopped. He was trying to find language that was adequate without being decorative. "I've spent my life believing that power was the thing that determined what happened, that if you had enough of it, applied correctly, you could determine outcomes, control things." He looked at the gorge. "You don't have power. You don't have resources. You don't have—" He stopped again. You were there first. You were there in the right way, doing the right things, and it saved lives, including my mother's, and it had nothing to do with power. Caleb was quiet for a moment. We showed up, he said. That's all it was. I know, that's what I'm trying to say. The showing up, consistently, without waiting to be asked, without calculating what it costs, I didn't understand that. I thought I was running an empire. I was just running a transaction. He turned and looked at Caleb directly. Watching your people work that night, I understood something about what it actually means to be responsible for something. Caleb held his gaze. The assessment still, after a year, still reading him, still taking the full measure. But something in it had changed from the assessment on the mountain. It was still thorough. It was less uncertain. You're going to be all right, Caleb said. It was not performance. It was his actual conclusion, stated as such. Victor looked at the gorge one more time. At the creek below, running in the October light. At the rock walls and the timber and the mountain that had been here before any of them and would be here after, carrying everything that happened on it in the specific way that geography carries history. Without judgment, without release. Just present, just itself, just the ground. He thought about his mother in the kitchen on Della Street, ironing, humming without knowing she was humming. He thought about the boy watching from the doorway. He thought about everything that had been built from that beginning, the transactions, and the empire, and the men who had been afraid, and the 12 years of trust that had been something else, and the mountain, and the rope, and the no that he'd meant, and the room in the federal building, and Kwame asking, are you trying to do good or feel better, and the pause before the answer. He thought about the floor of the community hall, the old grain showing through the new finish, preserved rather than covered. Let's go back down, he said. They went down the path together, through the timber and the rock sections, and the places where the exposed root system created a natural step, moving at a pace the mountain dictated, which was not fast, which was the pace of people who intend to arrive without damaging themselves on the way. Caleb moved ahead where the path narrowed, and Victor followed, and the October light moved through the timber in the particular way of late-season light, low-angled and honest, showing everything clearly. The path came out at the trailhead where Victor's car was parked. Below, through the trees, he could see the road, the repaired county road, the one that had been rebuilt after the crash, that now connected the past to the outside world in the way it should always have connected it. And further below that, not visible but present in the way that known things are present even when you can't see them, Hallow Ford, and the Learning Center with the refinished floor, and June Hartley's canvas jacket, and Helen Pruitt's kit, and the woodpile behind the community hall, and the creek, and the 63 people who had been there before the train, and who were still there and would be there, the people who did not leave because it was home, and home was worth the staying. Victor stood at the trailhead and looked at the road below. Caleb stood beside him. Marcus is home for winter break in December, Caleb said. He wants to show me something he's been working on. A design problem. Bridge load distribution, some modified approach he's developing. He looked at the road. He wants you there. Victor looked at him. Why? He said, Caleb stopped, the corner of his mouth again. He said he wants you to see what he did with it. Victor looked at the road, the light on the timber, the mountain holding its position above everything, indifferent and enormous and present. December, he said.